Florence Cook, Mediumship, Evidence, and the Cabinet. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Preface. The photograph is plain enough at first glance. A bearded man in dark clothes stands beside a young woman dressed in white. He looks solid, ordinary, of his century. She looks theatrical, pale cloth, pale skin, a staged stillness that belongs to the studio as much as the séance room. The man is Sir William Crookes, one of Victorian Britain's most celebrated scientific figures. The young woman is identified as Katie King, a spirit said to have walked out of the shadows and into the world. Between them sits a question that has not gone away. What exactly is being shown? An extraordinary event, a controlled deception, or a collaboration between belief and desire that neither side could later cleanly admit? This book is not written to resurrect ghosts. It is written to follow paper. Katie King is not a person the archives can reliably locate. There is no baptism register that can be produced without argument. No school record with a signature. No census entry that survives scrutiny. Katie King exists instead as a name spoken in darkened rooms, printed in newspapers, attached to photographs, and repeated across decades of commentary. She is a figure made of claims. Florence Cook can be found. Florence Cook was a teenage girl in London who became, for a time, the most disputed body in British spiritualism. She sat in cabinets and behind curtains. She was tied, searched, watched, and at moments when patience ran out, grabbed. Men of standing arrived to test her, to champion her, to denounce her, to protect their own reputations in relation to her. Admirers called her a conduit for proof that the dead survived. Skeptics called her a fraud. In the middle was a young woman whose life became a public experiment conducted in private rooms. If there is a crime at the heart of the story, it is not the easy, theatrical crime of a con artist caught in a trick. It is the harder, more human crime of what can be done to a girl, by institutions, by crowds, by press appetites, by powerful men who insist they are only investigating the truth. This is a historical true crime account of how Florence Cook became evidence. It begins with the ordinary, a household, a suburb, a girl whose name was not, at first, printed in papers. It moves through a social world where grief and curiosity were common, where parlor entertainments blended into religious yearning, and where a circle could be both a community and a stage. It follows the moment a specific spirit identity, Katie King, attached itself to Florence Cook's mediumship and grew into a public phenomenon. It then follows the men who came to adjudicate that phenomenon, and the printed record that those men left behind. The story cannot be told honestly without acknowledging the imbalance built into its very conditions. Florence Cook was young. The people who judged her were older. The settings were private. The consequences were public. The currency was reputation. Hers, theirs, and the movement's. That imbalance does not prove guilt or innocence. It simply shapes the case, like weather shapes a landscape. A reader deserves clarity about what is known, what is claimed, and what is impossible to know from the surviving record. This book is written with those boundaries held in view. What this book will and will not do. This book will not ask the reader to believe. It will not invite the reader to suspend disbelief. It will not use the gaps in the record as permission to invent. It will not turn a teenager's interior life into a novelist's playground, dressed up as history. It will do something less comforting and more rigorous. It will make the reader sit with uncertainty where uncertainty is honest, and it will show its workings wherever the record is strong enough to hold weight. It will separate 3 layers throughout. The documented event, what can be dated, traced, and supported by primary sources. The claim, what witnesses reported, what investigators asserted, what newspapers printed, what later writers repeated. The evaluation, what the evidence can reasonably support, and where it cannot. The tone is deliberately restrained. In true crime, the temptation is always to tilt the voice towards verdict. Here the verdict is not delivered by attitude, it is earned, or not earned, by the archive. The narrator stays quiet so the documents can be heard. The Victorian Room. To read Florence Cook's story, a modern reader must first understand the Victorian Room. This is not a world of bright overhead lighting and recorded footage. Séances were conducted in parlors and rented rooms. There were curtains, cabinets, and dim conditions said to be necessary for phenomena. There were codes of conduct: when to speak, when to sit still, when to refrain from interfering. Interference could mean touching the medium, moving towards the cabinet, or striking a match. Even in investigations billed as scientific, the environment was a negotiated space, part laboratory, part theater, part ritual. The room was also a marketplace. Spiritualism, in the mid to late 19th century, was not a fringe novelty confined to eccentrics. It was a movement that intersected with religion, science, politics, grief, and entertainment. It attracted working-class believers and wealthy patrons. It offered comfort to the bereaved and a kind of rebellion to those tired of orthodox authority. It also offered money, status, and access, things that could distort motives without erasing sincerity. In that room, a teenage girl could become a node of adult ambition. If she produced wonders, she was treasured. If she was suspected of trickery, she was hunted. Either way, she was watched. Florence Cook's story unfolds inside that watching. Evidence and its hierarchy. The core of this book rests on primary sources, especially accounts produced close to the events of the early 1870s. The most consequential of these is Sir William Crookes's published report on his inquiry into the phenomena called spiritual. Crookes was not a marginal figure. He was a respected scientist whose public endorsement of the phenomena carried immense weight with believers and caused lasting damage to his credibility among skeptics. His report matters not because it proves what he believed, but because it shows what he observed, how he framed it, what controls he claimed, and what he considered persuasive. Newspapers and periodicals also matter, though they must be handled carefully. Victorian press coverage could be sensational, partisan, or derivative, and it often treated spiritualism as entertainment even while reporting it as scandal. A newspaper account can preserve a date, a name, a public reaction. It can also distort a private event into a story shaped for sale. Later works, histories, biographies, critiques, are used as guides, not as substitutes for primary evidence. They are valuable for locating sources, identifying patterns, and situating events in broader context. They are also vulnerable to the historian's own commitments: pro-spiritualist, anti-spiritualist, debunking, sympathetic, moralizing. This book makes those leanings visible where they matter. Where sources conflict, the conflict is shown rather than smoothed away. The reader is not asked to accept a single tidy narrative. The Victorian record is not tidy. Any honest account must reflect that. A note on language. The vocabulary of the time is part of the evidence. Terms like medium, control, materialization, cabinet, and spirit carried specific meanings within spiritualist circles. They are used in this book as historical terms, not endorsements. Equally, the word fraud is used with care. Fraud is not a mood, it is an allegation that requires demonstration. Where fraud is asserted by contemporaries, it is identified as an assertion. Where it can be supported by evidence, the support is shown. Where it cannot be supported, the limits are stated. The same care is applied to the word victim. Florence Cook may have been exploited, she may have exploited others, she may have done both, at different times, under different pressures. Human beings are not single story. A book that begins with a conclusion tends to mishandle its subject. This book does not begin with a conclusion. Why Florence Cook, and why now? Florence Cook's case has survived because it sits at the intersection of several Victorian anxieties and desires: the hunger for proof of an afterlife, the romance of science investigating the unseen, the fear of trickery in an age of spectacle, and the uneasy status of women who claimed authority outside conventional structures. But there is another reason the case persists. It contains images. It contains names people recognize. It contains a respected scientist. It contains a young woman. It contains the cabinet, one of the most enduring symbols of the era's paranormal theater. And it contains a repeating pattern that feels painfully modern. A young person becomes famous through a contested performance. Adults fight over what she really is. The public consumes her as story, and her own voice becomes secondary to the arguments built upon her. Florence Cook's story is not simply a curiosity in psychical research history. It is a case study in reputation, power, and narrative control. In the early 1870s, a girl's body became a site of investigation. Investigators claimed to measure the truth. Critics claimed to expose it. Both sides depended on her being at the center. Few asked what it meant to keep her there. The case file approach. Because the subject has been repeatedly sensationalized, this book is structured like a case file. It begins with Florence Cook's documented circumstances, family, neighborhood, the social conditions under which a teenage girl might become a medium, and the early reports of her abilities. It then introduces Katie King as a name that attached itself to those reports, and it tracks how that name gained force through repetition, testimony, photography, and print. It follows the rise of Crooks's involvement and the publication that made the case impossible to ignore. It then follows the aftershocks, the way evidence was contested, how public opinion shifted, and what became of the people most closely connected to the phenomenon. The aim is not to provide a tidy mystery solved at the end. The aim is to show how the mystery was constructed, how it was argued over, and how the arguments reveal the values of the people who made them. Where possible, this book uses dates, locations, and direct attributions. When the record is thin, it says so. When the record is loud, it lets the reader hear the noise. A final word before we begin. In many true crime stories, the tension is built by withholding the solution. Here, the tension comes from a different source, the awareness that the solution may not exist in the way a modern audience expects. A séance is not a crime scene with preserved DNA. It is a social event. It is persuasion. It is darkness. It is etiquette. It is the human need to believe something beautiful, and the human capacity to exploit that need. It is also, sometimes, the human capacity to protect a vulnerable person by insisting she is extraordinary, rather than admitting she is trapped. Florence Cook was not a legend. She was a girl living in a particular time and place, in rooms filled with adults who wanted answers. Whether those adults received truth, performance, or a mixture of both, the historical record shows something unmistakable. The cost of the spectacle was not shared evenly. This book begins in London, not in the spirit world. It begins with Florence Cook before she became a controversy, before she became proof, before she became fraud, before she became a photograph that still provokes argument. It begins with a name on paper, and the quiet work of following it. Chapter 1, London Fields, 1870. The first thing to fix in place is the address. Florence Eliza Cook was still a child when her family moved from Kent to East London. By the time she was old enough to be noticed beyond her own street, they were living at Bruce Villas, opposite London Fields, a neat, specific detail that survives because it was printed and reprinted whenever her story was told. London Fields was not the London of the grand squares. It was not the London of the courts and clubs where reputations were minted and ruined in the same breath. It was a working domestic London, terraces, small schools, errands done on foot, a life made up of rooms that served multiple purposes, front parlor by day, séance space by night. The furniture did not change. The meaning did. In 1870 Florence was a teenager. She was young enough to be treated as a child when it suited the adults around her, and old enough to be held responsible for the full moral weight of whatever happened in a darkened room. That double standard is not an interpretation imposed from the present, it is built into the surviving accounts. She appears again and again as the girl medium, the object of wonder, the object of suspicion, the object of other people's certainty. The popular story of her mediumship begins not with a public performance, but with the sort of domestic diversion that was already familiar in middle and working class homes, table turning. A group of young people, a suggestion made half as amusement, half as thrill, and a decision to try it properly because someone had heard that it worked. Later writers would dress this beginning up with forebodings and destiny. The contemporary reality was likely more ordinary, until it wasn't. The Victorian parlour was a place where boundaries could be tested under the cover of manners. A table was respectable. A circle of hands was respectable. Dim light could be explained as atmosphere rather than concealment. A knock-on wood could be called a joke until it answered back. In Florence Cook's case, the claims that came out of those early evenings were not subtle. She was said to have produced raps and movements. She was said to have become, in effect, the center of the room's attention, not by stepping into it, but by being assigned to it. What matters, at the beginning, is not whether any phenomenon occurred. What matters is that a pattern formed, people gathered, Florence sat, something was reported, the story left the room. This is how a private life becomes public material. The nearby door. Not far from Florence Cook's home was a ready-made structure for turning odd parlor occurrences into organized inquiry, the Dalston Association of Inquirers into Spiritualism. According to biographical accounts, Florence's earliest séances were held at home, and during one of these she was advised, by a voice, a message, or someone in the circle repeating what the movement already knew to say, to contact that nearby association. The detail is telling because it shows the movement's instinct for routing fresh talent into a network. A girl could not become a phenomenon without audiences. A phenomenon could not survive without patrons. The association's secretary, Thomas Blyton, was impressed enough to put Florence Cook into print. He published about her in The Spiritualist, one of the period's key papers for circulating reports, endorsements, disputes, and warnings. In a world without recordings, print did the work of evidence. It made a transient room into a lasting claim. To modern eyes, this can look like publicity. To Victorian spiritualists, it looked like duty, proof of survival, proof of spirit, proof that the invisible could be handled as matter. But whether framed as service or promotion, the effect was the same. Florence Cook's name began to travel beyond London fields. Once a name travels, it cannot easily be called back. A girl with a job. If Florence Cook had remained only a curious teenager in a Hackney parlour, the story would be too small to persist. What enlarged it was the collision between a young woman's ordinary prospects and an extraordinary set of claims. For a time, Florence worked as an assistant at a private school in Richmond, an entirely believable employment pathway for a young woman of modest means, respectable, limited, and contingent. The record indicates she lost that job by 1872. Again, the detail matters because it locates the medium not as a theatrical professional from the outset, but as someone standing at the edge of conventional adulthood and finding that the edge was unstable. There are only so many respectable exits available to a teenage girl whose evenings are now occupied with visitors arriving to test her powers. A school can tolerate gossip up to a point. Families who pay fees do not like scandal. Even without proof of wrongdoing, the association alone could be enough to make employment precarious. The story that survives from this period is not simply of a girl who chose spiritualism. It is of a girl whose options narrowed while the eyes on her multiplied. Developing a gift. By 1871 to 72, Florence Cook was not operating as an isolated novelty. She was connected to established mediums, most notably Frank Hearne and Charles Williams, figures already known in spiritualist circles. The biography that can be traced through later summaries places her development under their influence and training. This is where the case begins to look less like spontaneous miracle and more like craft, tradition, and transmission. Mediumship, especially physical mediumship, was not only a claim. It was a method: the cabinet, the curtain, the dim light, the management of sitters, the pacing, the permissions granted and withheld. It was also a shared mythology. Mediums borrowed spirit controls from one another. Names repeated. Characters migrated between circles. A successful persona could become a kind of franchise. Frank Hearne, in particular, was associated with a powerful control spirit called John King. Within that mythology, Florence Cook became associated with Katie King, described as John King's daughter. The relationship between John and Katie is part of the movement's internal logic, a hierarchy of spirits, a structure that made the séance room feel governed rather than random. For Florence Cook, the practical result of this attachment was that her mediumship became narratively legible. She did not merely produce raps or lights. She became the doorway through which a named, recurring figure could be expected to appear. Katie King did not arrive as a fully formed body. The record indicates a progression: first, the suggestion of presence, then a face between curtains, then later, the claim of full physical materialization. The escalation is a classic pattern in séance reporting. It is also, from a true crime point of view, a pattern of increasing stakes. As the phenomenon grows bolder, the risk of exposure grows with it, and the management of witnesses becomes more important. The cabinet as a boundary. There is a reason so many 19th-century disputes about physical mediumship converge on the cabinet. A cabinet is, in one sense, a practical arrangement, a curtain space where a medium can sit, separate from the circle, allowing attention to focus on the threshold between the hidden and the seen. But it is also a boundary-making device. It creates an inside and an outside. It tells the sitter, you may watch but not enter, you may listen but not touch, you may believe but not interfere. That boundary is essential for phenomena. It is also essential for deception. Even among sympathetic observers, the materialization séance depended on conditions said to be required: very dim surroundings, controlled movement in the room, agreed behaviour from sitters. Later, when Crooks described his investigations, he made plain that he insisted on holding séances under his own conditions, in his own house, with his own apparatus and choice of witnesses. That insistence is often presented as proof of rigor. It is also an admission that the room itself, the arrangement, the permissions, the lighting, was understood to be the decisive factor. A true crime reader will recognize the dynamic. Control of the environment is control of the narrative. In Florence Cook's earliest period, the environment was not a laboratory. It was a home. It was a parlor, possibly crowded, where family members and neighbors could become a chorus of witnesses, each repeating the story slightly differently the next day. Later summaries mention a circle that included the family and household participants. Whether those details are stable across sources varies, and this book will treat them cautiously. What remains stable is that Florence began in a domestic setting and was rapidly drawn into a public one. The first public tension. Spiritualism did not only promise comfort. It promised proof, and proof invites challenge. The earliest disputes around Florence Cook are often told through an incident in which an attendee attempted to seize the spirit during a séance, resulting in accusations that the materialized figure was merely Florence herself. Even in brief summary, the incident exposes the movement's central tension. Sitters were expected to witness but not test. Skeptics wanted to test by force. Believers insisted that force destroyed the conditions necessary for manifestation. The details of this incident shift depending on the teller, and the motivations assigned to the Caesar shift as well. Those shifts will be examined later with the closest available sources. What matters here is the turning point it represents. Once a séance is disrupted publicly, the case stops being a private marvel and becomes a public controversy. A controversy requires sides. Sides require leaders. Leaders require symbols. Florence Cook's youth made her an ideal symbol. If she was genuine, she was proof that the gift was natural, innocent, and untrained, untainted by professional trickery. If she was fraudulent, she was proof that the movement preyed on the credulous and protected deception behind curtains. Either way, her age and gender made her useful. The making of a witness. Thomas Blyton's publication in The Spiritualist is one of the early steps in turning Florence Cook's name into a case. But print did more than spread news. It trained readers in how to witness. Séance reports were written in a particular style, measured, moral, attentive to small physical details. They enumerated conditions: who was present, where the medium sat, what light was used, whether hands were held, whether the cabinet was searched. They did not merely tell a story, they laid groundwork for credibility. This mattered because spiritualism was always in a war over standards. Believers wanted spiritual phenomena judged by the standards of testimony and sincerity. Skeptics wanted them judged by the standards of exposure. Scientists who ventured in wanted to claim laboratory authority without always being able to impose laboratory realities. In that war, a teenage girl was both a person and a piece of evidence. Florence Cook's early career, as it is now recoverable, shows her moving quickly from home sittings into organized circles, and then into the attention of investigators. The speed is important. It suggests a hunger in the movement for new proof, and a readiness to elevate a young medium to prominence before the consequences for her were fully understood. A name that isn't hers. Katie King enters this chapter as a name attached to Florence Cook sessions, not as a separate biography. This is an essential distinction, and it will not be blurred for narrative convenience. Katie King cannot be located in the way Florence Cook can be located. The record does not allow it. What can be located is when the name appears, how it is described, who endorses it, who disputes it, and how it becomes entangled with Florence's body in the eyes of witnesses. To write historical true crime about Florence Cook is to write about how an identity can be built in the dark and defended in print. The name Katie offered a face for the phenomenon, sometimes literally, as reports speak of a face at the curtain. It offered a way for sitters to talk about what they believed they saw without admitting they might simply have been watching the medium. It offered a third thing in the room, not Florence, not the sitters, but a she who could be blamed, praised, touched, measured, photographed. Once she exists, accountability changes shape. If a sitter feels cheated, it is easier to accuse the spirit world of trickery than to accuse a girl to her face. If a sitter feels convinced, it is easier to elevate the spirit than to face the possibility that a girl has performed something extraordinary under pressure. The spirit persona absorbs both suspicion and devotion. Florence, meanwhile, remains the material fact, the one who is there every time. Approaching the investigator. By the early 1870s, the case was ripe for a figure like William Crookes. Crooks was not a spiritualist minister or a parlor enthusiast. He was a scientist with standing. His involvement would later be treated as the turning point that made the Cook case famous beyond spiritualist circles. In his own published writing about spiritual phenomena, Crooks acknowledged the conflict between scientific preconception and what he claimed to witness, presenting himself as a reluctant traveler into disputed territory. But before Crooks, there was already a case, a teenage medium, a network of believers, printed endorsements, and disruptions that signaled that not everyone in the room agreed to be only a witness. Florence Cook's earliest period is therefore not a prelude. It is the first stage of the crime scene, the formation of conditions in which extraordinary claims could be made, circulated, defended, and attacked. The reader does not need to accept the claims to understand the mechanism. The mechanism is human. It is ambition. It is grief. It is belonging. It is boredom. It is the appetite for a story that feels like proof. It is also the vulnerability of a girl whose life becomes organized around a cabinet and a curtain. What remains, and what does not. At this distance, Florence Cook's childhood interior life cannot be responsibly narrated in detail. The record does not provide diaries that can be quoted at length, nor school writings that reveal her voice without mediation. Some later biographical sketches include charming scenes, childhood visions, angelic voices, foretold destiny, but these belong to a genre of spiritualist storytelling that tends to polish its subjects into symbols. This book will not build its foundations on that polish. What can be responsibly stated, even at the start, is simpler and more solid. Florence Cook was a young Londoner whose mediumistic claims began in her teens. Her earliest seances were held at home, and she was directed into contact with a nearby spiritualist association that amplified her. Her name entered print through organizational channels, and her sessions became connected to established mediums and a shared spirit mythology. Katie King emerged as an identity within that mythology, developing in reports over time into a materialized figure. Those facts are enough to begin a true crime narrative, because true crime does not require a corpse. It requires a contest over truth where the stakes are real. By the time Crooks steps into the story, Florence Cook is no longer merely a girl with an odd parlor reputation. She is already an object of public argument. The room has already been prepared for a scientist to arrive and declare, one way or another, what the world is allowed to believe. Chapter 2: The Association, the Paper, and the Curtain. A case becomes a case when it leaves the room. In Florence Cook's early months as a teenage medium, the room was domestic, a parlor opposite London Fields, a table, a circle of hands, a small audience drawn by proximity and curiosity. But spiritualism in East London did not rely on chance gatherings for long. It had infrastructure, addresses, meeting nights, subscriptions, secretaries, rules. It had, above all, a paper trail. One of the first surviving public hints of that infrastructure is not dramatic at all. It reads like an announcement. The Dalston Association of Inquirers into Spiritualism, established in 1870, advertised itself plainly: weekly séances, a developing library, prospectuses and rules available from its secretary. These details matter because they show how quickly spiritualism moved from private fascination into organized routine. This was not only belief, it was administration. A library is not built for a single thrill. A weekly meeting night is not arranged for a one-off marvel. An association suggests continuity, and continuity is what turns an unusual girl into an enduring phenomenon. Florence Cook was guided, in the spiritualist telling, towards that continuity. According to later summaries, she began holding séances at home and was told during one sitting that she should contact the nearby Dalston Association. She did, and the association's secretary, Thomas Blyton, was impressed enough to publicize her in The Spiritualist. The fact is simple: a local network took notice, and the network had a means of publication. Publication changes the conditions of witnessing. A sitter who sees something in a parlor can forget it, dismiss it, or keep it private. A sitter who reads about it in print receives it as report, framed as evidence. The report may be secondhand, it may be embellished, it may be sincere and still mistaken. But the effect is the same. Print makes an event portable. By September 1871, the spiritualist could refer to Miss Florence Cook at Bruce Villas as the now medium, and discuss her in the context of trance sensitivity, how certain people's proximity or touch was said to distress entranced subjects. The phrasing is revealing. Now medium is not merely descriptive. It signals status. Florence Cook had shifted from girl in a parlor to medium in the movement's own vocabulary, with the paper acting as witness and amplifier. The paper also trained its audience in the movement's etiquette, what counted as proper conduct around a medium, and what counted as interference. From the beginning, Florence Cook's public identity was threaded through this expectation. The medium was to be observed under conditions said to protect the phenomenon. Those conditions would later become the battlefield. Thursday nights and the making of an investigator. The Dalston Association, like many spiritualist groups, positioned itself as a place for inquiry, an organized answer to skepticism. It offered facilities to investigators and framed its work as the collection of well-authenticated facts about spiritualism. That language, facts, investigation, inquiry, is part of the period's self-justification. It suggests a movement eager to be treated as serious, perhaps scientific, and certainly moral. But it also masks a basic vulnerability. Spiritualist facts were often produced under conditions the movement itself controlled. The investigator was invited in, but only so far. The room belonged to the believers. The medium was protected by rules. The association's advertisements are careful about that. They offer prospectuses and rules, subscriptions and hours, as if the movement's greatest strength lay in its orderliness. For a teenage medium, orderliness could be both refuge and trap. The association provided audiences and defenders. It also placed Florence within a system that would expect performance, whether understood as spiritual labor or, in the skeptical view, theatrical production. This is the first true crime mechanism in the story. Once a phenomenon is institutionalized, it must be maintained. Apprenticeship, Hearn, Williams, and the borrowed mythology. By 1871-72, Florence Cook's development is consistently described as occurring under the influence of two established physical mediums, Frank Hearn and Charles Williams. This is where the narrative begins to acquire its repeating characters. Hearn was associated with the spirit John King, a prominent control in seance mythology, described in later summaries as a figure who organized manifestations and spoke with authority in the room. In some accounts, John King claimed to be the buccaneer Henry Morgan. Whether that claim is treated as romance or absurdity depends on the teller, but it was part of the mythology that made the seance feel governed. Florence Cook became associated with Katie King, introduced as John King's daughter within that spiritualist family structure. This is not a trivial detail. A spirit with a name and relationship is easier to remember and harder to dismiss. A named spirit can return. A named spirit can develop a personality. A named spirit can be called upon to answer for itself. A name creates continuity across sittings and across rooms. It also creates the possibility of brand. Physical mediumship in this era was not a private hobby. It traveled through circles, associations, and newspapers. Spirit identities, especially successful ones, could migrate, attach to different mediums, and become the subject of recurring public fascination. That migration complicates the question who was Katie King, because it points to a phenomenon bigger than any single girl. It suggests that Katie was, in part, a role within a shared repertoire. Florence Cook's training under Hearn and Williams is therefore not simply a biographical footnote. It marks the moment her mediumship became legible within an established system, complete with cabinet techniques, seance etiquette, and a ready-made spirit hierarchy. True crime often hinges on transmission, a method learned, a practice normalized, a script repeated until it becomes second nature. In Florence Cook's case, the script included the idea that what emerged from the cabinet was not Florence, but someone else. The curtain, from face to form. The record, in broad outline, describes a progression in the Katie King manifestations. Katie is said to have developed from a disembodied appearance, often described as a face at or between curtains, towards a fuller materialization. It is a familiar escalation in seance literature. First, the slightest proof, a hand, a light, a whisper. Then the bolder claim, a face. Finally, the most daring, a body that can be touched, weighed, photographed. Escalation serves belief because it feels like progress. It also serves showmanship because it raises stakes and draws bigger audiences. Whether one interprets the escalation as spiritual development or as a calculated theatrical ladder, it produces the same social effect, expectation. And expectation, once established, becomes a demand. This is where the cabinet becomes central, not as an exotic relic but as a practical device. The cabinet created a threshold. It allowed witnesses to say they saw something outside the medium while the medium was presumed inside. It gave the room a built-in alibi. If the medium is hidden, then what appears cannot easily be the medium, unless the boundary is breached. That boundary was defended as etiquette. In spiritualist culture, proper conduct meant remaining seated, refraining from touching the figure that appeared, and avoiding sudden light. Breaking those rules could be framed as sabotage, not only rude, but morally corrupting, even dangerous. The movement needed those rules to protect the phenomenon. It also needed them to protect the medium. But protection is never pure. Protection can also protect a trick. This is why the Cook case attracted not only believers but would-be investigators who refused to accept the room's rules. A paper that taught people how to see. The spiritualist did more than report. It instructed. The paper's habit of describing trance distress, how certain people's touch could cause pain, how proximity could disrupt lucidity, functions as a warning and a guideline: do not interfere. Read as a practical precaution, it is sensible within the movement's worldview. Read as a safeguard against exposure, it is convenient. In either reading, it sets a standard by which later conflicts could be judged. The skeptic who grabbed was not merely skeptical, he was improper. This becomes crucial in the famous 1873 incident that would later be used as a turning point. On December 9, 1873, at Hackney, a lawyer named William Volkman attended a séance with Florence Cook. According to later summaries, Katie King materialized and held hands with sitters as was customary. Volkman seized the figure and accused it of being Cook masquerading as the spirit. The figure was pulled free by other participants and returned to the cabinet. Cook later emerged. Volkman published his conclusion that the spirit was a masquerade. Cook's supporters denounced him for breaking séance etiquette and suggested ulterior motives. In a modern courtroom, the act of grabbing would be treated as interference with evidence. In a modern fraud investigation, it might be treated as a crude but direct test. In the séance room, it was treated as violence, against the spirit, against the medium, against the conditions required for the phenomenon. The same act can be described as assault or as exposure. The description depends on allegiance. This is the second true crime mechanism. When a community sets the rules for what counts as legitimate testing, it can define disproof as misconduct. Florence Cook's public life was now caught between two incompatible standards. One standard demanded reverent witness. The other demanded physical verification. No one could satisfy both. Work, respectability, and the narrowing corridor. At the same time, Florence Cook's ordinary prospects were becoming fragile. Later summaries state she briefly worked as an assistant at a private school in Richmond and had lost the job by 1872. The detail is often repeated because it fits a moral arc. The respectable world could not tolerate the haunted girl. But the detail also points to a practical reality. Respectability in Victorian England depended on reputation, and reputation depended on what was said about you when you were not in the room. Once Florence's name was in print as a medium, she could be dismissed without proof of wrongdoing. A school did not need to adjudicate the truth of séances, it only needed to protect itself from gossip. This does not prove that phenomena were occurring. It proves only that Florence's social world was reacting to the reports of phenomena, reacting strongly enough to constrict her future. A constricted future changes incentives. It can make spiritualism look like an opportunity. It can make it look like the only room left that will have you. True crime tends to ask why a person chose a path. History more often shows that the path narrowed until a choice became a step. The circle tightens. By the end of 1873, the elements that would later explode into full public controversy were already in place. A teenage medium with a name that traveled beyond her street. An organized association presenting itself as a site of inquiry, with rules and advertised meetings. A spirit persona, Katie King, embedded in a shared mythology linked to established mediums and a prominent control spirit. A method of manifestation dependent on darkness, curtains, and behavioral agreements. A conflict over what testing was allowed to look like, made visible in the Volkman incident and its competing interpretations. This is the case file before the scientist arrives. Crookes is often treated as the beginning because his name carries authority. But authority does not create a phenomenon out of nothing. It arrives at a moment when a phenomenon has already been shaped into something that can be endorsed or demolished in public. When Crookes stepped into the Cook story, he stepped into a room where a teenage girl had already become the movement's evidence and its vulnerability. Florence Cook was carried forward by a network that believed it was investigating truth, while simultaneously setting the rules that controlled how truth could be challenged. A cabinet can hide a trick. It can also hide a child. And sometimes the two possibilities are so entangled that the record cannot separate them without leaving bruises on the page. Chapter 3: Crooks's Conditions. William Crooks did not enter Florence Cook's story as a passerby. He entered it as a man accustomed to being believed. By the early 1870s, Crooks was already publicly established, an investigator with a scientific reputation and a habit of speaking in the language of measurement. When a person like that turns his attention to a contested phenomenon, the phenomenon changes shape. It stops being only a parlor rumor or a movement's internal proof. It becomes a public test of boundaries, what counts as evidence, what counts as bias, and what it costs to be the body under examination. Crooks's own account makes clear that he did not accept the usual séance terms offered by spiritualist circles. He insisted on controlling the setting, controlling the witnesses, and controlling the apparatus. He describes taking the inquiry into his own environment and making the conditions his rather than the medium's. That insistence is often repeated as the story's guarantee of seriousness. It deserves to be read more carefully than that. Because control can serve two masters. It can serve rigor. It can also serve narrative. The House as Laboratory. Crooks titled his published account plainly, Notes of an Inquiry into the Phenomena Called Spiritual, during the years 1870 to 73. The title presents the work as record-keeping rather than advocacy, as if he is merely putting observations on file. He frames himself as methodical, an observer who arranged his own tests, who was wary of fraud, and who was willing to be guided only by what he could witness. The report repeatedly emphasizes the precautions he took: hands held, doors watched, rooms controlled, the medium searched or secured, the lighting managed. In a true crime narrative, this reads like a detective laying out chain of custody. I controlled the room, therefore the evidence is clean. But a séance is not a sealed crime scene. It is a social performance conducted under negotiated rules. The reader must hold two facts at once. Crooks believed he was controlling the environment. The environment itself, darkness, cabinets, curtain thresholds, was structurally favorable to ambiguity. Crooks's report is valuable precisely because it shows how a confident, educated investigator attempted to treat ambiguity as if it could be contained by procedure. Florence Cook under authority. Florence Cook was a teenager. In Crooks's report, she is described and handled as a subject. This is not a moral judgment, it is a description of the dynamic that appears on the page. Crooks's language places Florence within an experimental frame. She is the medium through which phenomena are tested. He discusses the ways she was secured, monitored, and separated from the alleged spirit form that appeared. He was not only observing Florence, he was authoring her public identity. In the Victorian press economy, the words of a respected scientist did not merely describe a person. They created a version of that person that would outlive her. From this point, Florence Cook is no longer only a medium discussed in spiritualist circles. She becomes an exhibit in a broader argument over modernity, whether science could investigate spiritual claims, and whether spiritual claims could survive investigation. The figure at the curtain. Crooks's most dramatic material concerns the alleged materialization of Katie King, the spirit identity said to appear independently of Florence Cook. In his published notes, he describes sittings in which Katie was seen, spoken with, and most controversially, handled as a physical presence distinct from the medium. This is the point where the reader must separate what Crooks claims occurred, in his own words and structure, and what can be independently verified beyond that claim. Crooks provides the structure of evidence he believed sufficient. The medium is in one place, the spirit figure appears in another, precautions are maintained, therefore the figure is not the medium. He also records procedures meant to address the most obvious objection, that Florence could have left the cabinet and returned undetected. He describes monitoring arrangements and moments in which he believed he observed both Florence and Katie at once. In modern terms, Crooks is attempting to eliminate the simplest explanation, impersonation, through controlled observation. In the terms of his era, he is doing something even more culturally charged. He is proposing that a phenomenon associated with women's bodies and domestic rooms can be examined under the authority of male science. This is why the Cook case did not stay small. The stakes were never only whether a girl could trick a room. The stakes were whether the scientist could be tricked, and what it would mean if he wasn't. Measurement, apparatus, and the Victorian hunger for proof. Crooks's report is not written like a ghost story. It is written like someone trying to make a ghost hold still for measurement. He describes the use of instruments and controlled arrangements to test force phenomena in other contexts, and he carries that impulse into his spiritual inquiry, the desire to convert the contested fleeting séance experience into something measurable and therefore defensible. In the Cook sittings, the measurable details often turn on the body, its position, its separation, its visibility. Crooks's claim of significance is not only that something appeared, but that it appeared under conditions he believed prevented trickery. The reader should notice what follows from this. If Crooks's procedures are accepted, then the consequences are enormous. If his procedures are flawed, then the consequences are personal. Because a scientist who publishes an extraordinary claim without extraordinary proof does not merely risk being wrong. He risks his standing. He risks his field. He risks becoming a story. Crooks published anyway. The photograph that refuses to behave. Alongside written testimony, the Cook case is anchored by photographs, images that appear to offer the simplest kind of proof. Here is the figure, here is the investigator, here is what they say they saw. The problem with photographs in 19th century spiritualism is that they do not settle arguments, they harden them. Believers see what they want confirmed. Skeptics see what they want exposed. And the photograph becomes a relic people can point at rather than a question people must answer. Institutional collections preserve at least one well-known image described as Crooks with the spirit Katie King, the sort of artifact that keeps the story alive in the public imagination. In a strict historical true crime frame, the photograph is treated as evidence of one thing beyond dispute: Crooks was willing to be publicly associated with the claim. That is not proof of a spirit. It is proof of commitment. And commitment changes behaviour. It changes what a person notices, what a person excuses, and what a person is willing to stake his name upon. Authority and its blind spots. Crooks's inquiry sits at a dangerous junction. He is both witness and advocate, both investigator and the most valuable witness the spiritualists could ever have hoped to recruit. His report presents his observations as the product of caution, yet the very act of publishing signals confidence. The reader is not required to decide in this chapter whether that confidence was justified. The reader is required only to see how the confidence functions inside the case. It functions in three ways. It converts private testimony into public claim. Once Crooks writes, the Cook phenomena stop belonging only to the movement. They become a matter for wider debate. It shifts suspicion. Before Crooks, the focus was easily kept on the medium. Is the girl lying? After Crooks, the focus spreads. Is the scientist compromised? Is the public unfit to judge? Are skeptics cruel? Are believers naive? It increases the stakes for Florence Cook. A medium praised by ordinary sitters may be dismissed as a parlor performer. A medium endorsed by Crooks becomes a flashpoint. The attacks intensify. The scrutiny becomes more invasive. The audience becomes more dangerous. In true crime, the presence of an authority figure often reassures the reader. Here, it does the opposite. Authority complicates the case because it introduces the possibility that the investigator's reputation becomes part of the motive structure. If Crooks is wrong, he has reason to protect himself. If Florence is exposed, he has reason to defend his judgment. If spiritualists are attacked, he has reason to frame skeptics as biased. None of this requires a conspiracy. It requires only the ordinary human instinct to preserve the self. What Crooks can prove, and what he cannot. Crooks can prove that he conducted sittings and believed he observed phenomena. He can prove that he wrote down what he thought happened. He can prove that he considered his precautions sufficient. He cannot, by his report alone, remove all alternative explanations, particularly explanations that rely on what cannot be monitored in a darkroom with a curtain cabinet and an audience trained not to interfere. This is not a judgment against him. It is a boundary of method. A Victorian investigator could control the room as he understood control. He could not control the psychology of perception, the social pressure of a séance circle, or the structural fact that the crucial moment always occurred at the threshold of visibility. In other words, Crooks's report is a primary source of immense value, not because it closes the case, but because it shows how the case was argued by a man with the most to lose. The case turns public. Crooks's publication did not end the controversy. It sharpened it. Once printed, the Cook phenomena became a dispute not only about a medium, but about the legitimacy of scientific inquiry into spiritualism. Crooks's name guaranteed attention from those who would otherwise ignore the movement. It also guaranteed hostility from those who considered the movement an embarrassment. From here, the story moves quickly towards the most violent kind of test: the forceful seizure, the accusation of impersonation, the public fight over whether breaking the rules of the séance room was heroism or assault. The Cook case becomes, increasingly, a struggle over who is allowed to decide what happened in the dark. Florence Cook's body remains the site of that struggle. The cabinet, by now, is no longer simply a curtain in a private room. It is a national argument. Chapter 4: The Seizure and the Split. A séance is built on agreement. Not agreement about what is true necessarily, only agreement about how the room will behave while truth is being pursued. People sit where they are told. They keep their hands where they are told. They accept dim light because they are told it is necessary. They accept the cabinet because they are told it is protective. They accept the presence of a control spirit, and the idea that a named figure may appear, because the movement has taught them that naming is a form of order. The Cook case did not rupture because someone finally discovered a decisive fact. It ruptured because someone broke the agreement. On December 9, 1873, at Hackney, Florence Cook held a séance at which the figure called Katie King was said to materialize. A lawyer named William Volkman attended. When Katie appeared, the room followed the familiar script. The figure was reported to have held the hands of sitters, a gesture that carried meaning in materialization circles, an assurance that the spirit was solid, present, and crucially, not the medium. Volkman did not accept the script. According to the standard contemporary summary repeated in later accounts, Volkman became suspicious of the figure's resemblance to Florence Cook. He seized the spirit by the hand and waist and accused it of being Cook masquerading as Katie King. Other participants wrestled the figure from him and forced it back to the cabinet. Some minutes later, Florence Cook emerged from that cabinet. Volkman later published his conclusion: the spirit was a masquerade. In a single movement, hand to waist, the séance stopped being an experience and became an allegation. That movement did something else as well. It created two stories that could not be reconciled, because each story depended on a different moral code. Two versions of the same room. In Volkman's version, the act of grabbing was an act of exposure. The cabinet was not a boundary to be respected, it was a mechanism that enabled deception. The dim light was not a necessary condition, it was a convenience. The movement's etiquette, in this frame, was not protection for fragile phenomena but protection for fraud. In the movement's version, the act of grabbing was a breach of contract, an agreed rule violated, and therefore not evidence of anything except the grabber's misconduct. Spiritualists and Cook supporters denounced Volkman on the grounds that he had entered the room under an agreement to proper séance etiquette. In their view, his interference invalidated his claim to be an investigator at all. They offered an additional insinuation that would recur whenever spiritualism needed to neutralize a critic. Volkman was said to be associated with another medium, Mrs. Guppy, and might have wished to damage a rival. They also used a technical argument drawn from spiritualist theory: even if Katie resembled Florence, that resemblance did not prove impersonation, because materialized spirits were believed to borrow substance and energy from the medium producing them. Resemblance could be explained without fraud. One room, one event, two incompatible standards. The skeptic's standard: interference is permitted if it reveals deception. The spiritualist standard: interference destroys the conditions and therefore destroys the experiment. Neither standard can win inside the other's logic. That is why the incident became so corrosive. It could not be settled by argument. It could only be settled by allegiance. What a seizure does to a case. True crime often turns on a moment when someone refuses to keep playing their assigned role. Volkman attended as a sitter, a witness, yet behaved as a physical tester. In doing so, he forced everyone else in the room to choose what they were there for. Were they there to witness, as the etiquette demanded? Or were they there to test, as inquiry implied? The two aims are similar until the moment they conflict. The Cook phenomenon depended on that similarity. It depended on the idea that witnessing under controlled conditions was testing. The moment Volkman grabbed the figure, he declared that witnessing was not enough. The room responded the way communities respond when their central practice is threatened: it defended itself. Other participants wrestled the figure away. The figure was forced back to the cabinet. Cook emerged later. Each of those details matters because each detail provides material for both sides. If the seized figure was Florence Cook in a garment, then forcing her into the cabinet looks like a rescue operation, protecting the medium from humiliation and the movement from collapse. If the seized figure was a fragile materialization, then forcing it back looks like protection, preventing harm to something the sitters believed could be injured by roughness. The action is the same. The meaning is split. And once meaning splits, the case becomes more public, not less. Exposure as a weapon. After the incident, supporters of Cook noted that newspapers were referring to what happened as an exposure. That word is never neutral. To call something an exposure is to declare the conclusion in the headline. It tells the reader not only that a medium has been shown fraudulent, but that the fraud was already there, waiting to be uncovered, and that the person doing the uncovering deserves credit. It also tells the reader that the medium is not merely mistaken or misguided, but dishonest. In Victorian print culture, words like exposure carried social consequences that were difficult to reverse. Once a young woman was exposed, she was not simply disproved, she was morally stained. Employers, landlords, neighbors, people who did not attend seances, could still punish a girl on the strength of that single word. This is the point where the Cook case stops looking like a niche spiritualist drama and begins to look like a reputational crime, a public accusation against a teenage girl that could not be fully litigated, because the crime scene was a dark room and the evidence was contested behaviour. Florence Cook had been young when she began. She was still young now, and the audience around her was increasingly composed of adults whose reputations were bound to their interpretation of her. Why the movement needed rules. It is tempting, especially in skeptical retellings, to treat séance etiquette as pure cover, a set of manners designed to make fraud possible. But etiquette also performed a social function that mattered even for sincere believers. Spiritualist circles were not only sites of wonder, they were sites of grief, community, and meaning-making. A circle that collapsed into brawling would not survive. Rules made the room usable. That dual purpose, community stability and phenomenon protection, helps explain why the Volkmann Act was treated as scandalous. A person who grabbed did not merely test a claim, he threatened the room's identity. This is why spiritualist writing often framed interference as not only improper but harmful. It was not simply rude, it was described as injuring the fragile process of materialization and, by extension, the people entranced within it. For Florence Cook, this language could cut both ways. It could protect her from physical assault. It could also trap her inside a system where the most direct tests were forbidden, meaning suspicion could never be cleanly resolved. A medium cannot be conclusively vindicated under conditions where vindication is always said to require the absence of disruptive testing. Equally, a medium cannot be fairly condemned when every disruptive test can be blamed for destroying the conditions. The Cook case existed inside that trap. The rivalries underneath. The Volkmann episode also surfaced something spiritualist communities rarely like to admit openly: rivalry. Supporters suggested Volkmann had connections to Agnes Nicol-Guppy, Mrs. Guppy, another well-known medium, and that he might have wished to injure a competitor. Whether or not that claim can be substantiated in a way that satisfies modern standards, its presence in the discourse is revealing. It shows that even among believers, suspicion moved not only between believers and skeptics, but within the movement itself. Spiritualism was a social world. Social worlds contain status. Status invites competition. Competition invites tactics. In the Cook story, those tactics could look like questioning a sitter's motives, implying a critic was acting as an agent for another medium, suggesting that only proper observers were morally fit to judge, insisting that resemblance between medium and spirit was expected, not suspicious. Each tactic did not need to be consciously cynical to function as defense. Communities often protect themselves by reaching for the explanations already available to them. The result, for Florence Cook, was that she became both symbol and battleground. The arguments were ostensibly about Katie King, yet they landed on Florence's body. The hand that was seized was Katie's, but the accusation was against Florence. The decision to seek a stronger witness. After Volkmann's published allegation and the press's embrace of exposure, Cook and her supporters sought stronger support. The narrative that survives in later summaries is explicit. They turned to William Crookes, whose scientific stature could counter the moral weight of the accusation. This is a crucial turning point, and it does not require speculation. It fits the logic of the moment. If the public believes a medium has been exposed, the movement has two options: retreat into its own circles, insisting outsiders are biased, or Recruit a witness whose authority outsiders are inclined to trust. Crooks was the ideal witness because he stood outside the movement's usual social identity while also being curious enough, already investigating spiritual phenomena, to step into the room. His willingness to impose conditions at my own house, and under my own selection later, became part of his public defense. For Florence Cook, Crooks's involvement created a new kind of risk. If he endorsed her, her reputation might be repaired, partially, temporarily, controversially. If he rejected her, the rejection would be fatal. The Cook case from this point forward is not only about whether a phenomenon occurred. It is about what happens to a young woman when a powerful man stakes his credibility on her. What can be responsibly said about the truth of the seizure? A reader may want the most basic resolution. Was Volkmann right? At the level of the surviving summaries, there is no single decisive piece of evidence that forces closure. What exists is a conflict between claims. Volkmann's claim: he physically seized the materialized figure and believed it to be Florence Cook. Cook supporters claim: Volkmann broke the rules, invalidating his interpretation, resemblance was expected under spiritualist theory, and his motives were suspect. What can be said, without speculation, is that the incident changed the case's trajectory. It created a hard public split that demanded escalation. A controversy that might otherwise have remained inside spiritualist papers moved outward because the word exposure traveled more easily than any careful account of séance conditions. That is the quiet cruelty of reputational scandals. The simplest verdict spreads fastest. The body in the middle. In the months after Volkmann's seizure, the Cook case becomes increasingly centered on procedure: where the medium sat, what she wore, how she was secured, who held her hands, whether doors were watched, whether wires were used, whether observers could see both the medium and the figure at once. This procedural focus can feel clinical, even obsessive. It is also a consequence of the movement's central vulnerability. If the phenomenon cannot be replicated under ordinary light and ordinary scrutiny, then the argument will always return to conditions. And conditions always return to the medium's body. For Florence Cook, that meant being tied, watched, measured, discussed. Even before Crooks's most famous sittings, the logic of the dispute had already made her a site of struggle. The Volkmann incident did not create that logic, it exposed it. A modern reader may notice something else in the details. The spirit was said to be holding hands with sitters, close enough to be seized. This implies a ritual of permitted touch that sits uneasily beside the movement's insistence on non-interference. Touch was allowed, under supervision and consent. Touch became forbidden only when it turned accusatory. In other words, the movement's rules did not ban contact. They banned uncontrolled contact. That distinction mattered greatly. It meant the room could be intimate without becoming investigative. It meant a figure could be physically proved by a gentle handhold, while remaining protected from the kind of grip that might collapse the illusion, or damage the person inside it. The split that never healed. After Hackney, the Cook story carried a permanent scar, a moment when a man's hands turned a spiritual encounter into a physical struggle. From that point, every subsequent report would be read in the shadow of that struggle. Every assurance of controls would be weighed against the idea that the only decisive control, the skeptic's grip, was condemned as immoral. Every skeptical reference to exposure would be met with the argument that exposure was itself a kind of cheating, an act that invalidated the experiment by breaking it. The story becomes less about what happened in the cabinet, and more about who is allowed to approach it. This is why Crooks matters in the next stage. He offered the appearance of a bridge between the two standards. He was a controlled investigator, yet he worked within the cabinet system rather than tearing it down. He promised rigor without the violence of seizure. Whether that promise could ever have been fulfilled is the next question. Chapter 5. The Paper Record. Crooks's investigation did not begin with Florence Cook in a cabinet. It began with a document designed to set terms. In January 1874, he published what he called Notes of an Inquiry into the Phenomena Called Spiritual, during the years 1870 to 73, a paper that reads less like a séance narrative than a declaration of method. He opens with a comparison that matters. He likens himself to a traveler entering unfamiliar territory, someone determined to replace rumor with observed fact. It is a rhetorical move and an organizational move at the same time. The reader is invited to follow him not into mystery but into classification, categories of phenomena, increasingly complex, arranged as if they belong to natural knowledge waiting to be mapped. This is the moment where Crooks attempts to take spiritualism out of the parlor and into a frame that resembles science. He does not do that by insisting that the séance room looks like a laboratory. He does it by insisting that the reader treat his procedures as the laboratory. Correcting errors the public had already decided. Crooks says he must first correct errors that have taken hold of the public mind. The first is the claim that darkness is essential to spiritual phenomena. He rejects it, at least in principle, and says that except where darkness is specifically required, as with some luminous effects, everything he records has taken place in the light. This is a calculated stance. It addresses the most common suspicion, that darkness exists for concealment. He concedes something at the same time. Bright light, he says, can interfere when the force is weak. In other words, darkness is not always necessary, but it is sometimes useful, and there are reasons why a medium might ask for it. That sentence alone contains the future argument in miniature. A skeptic reads it as an opening for trickery. A believer reads it as a sensible condition. Crooks reads it as an experimental variable. He corrects a second error, that phenomena can only be witnessed at certain times and places, at the medium's convenience, in the medium's rooms, with all the appliances of an illusionist. This is where he places his most pointed claim, that with very few exceptions, the facts he attests have taken place in his own house, at times appointed by himself, under circumstances that he says excluded even the simplest instrumental aids. The phrase "my own house" is not just a location. It is a claim to jurisdiction. Carrying off the priestess. Crooks then makes a third correction, that the medium must select the circle, that the sitters must be believers, and that conditions are imposed on investigators that facilitate deception. His reply is blunt. He says he has chosen his own circle of friends, introduced hard-headed unbelievers when he pleased, and generally imposed his own terms, carefully chosen to prevent fraud. The image he uses a page earlier is more vivid. He says he has sometimes been permitted to apply tests, but only once or twice has he been allowed to carry off the priestess from her shrine, bring her to his own house, and test what he witnessed elsewhere under less conclusive conditions. It is a revealing metaphor, even in passing. The medium as priestess, a figure with authority in her own space. The shrine, the medium's room, the medium's rules, the medium's protective community. Carrying her off, removal from that authority into his. He frames this not as coercion but as privilege, permission granted. The language implies that mediums guarded their territory, and that the investigator's triumph was in relocating the scene. In the Cook case, this relocation will become the central defense, that Crooks did not witness wonders in a medium's parlor, where the medium might control the space, but in his own house, where he believed he controlled it. A method built for argument. Crooks's paper is arranged to withstand ridicule. He anticipates the comparison to conjuring and rejects it, insisting that what he has seen cannot be imitated by known mechanical means, even by professional illusionists backed with elaborate machinery. He anticipates accusations of delusion and addresses them later in the paper as theories that must satisfy all conditions of the problem. He builds his credibility not by describing a single spectacular scene in full, but by presenting himself as the man who has seen hundreds of facts and is prepared to attest them. Then he classifies. The classification is important because it reveals how Crooks wanted to be read. He starts with simpler reported phenomena, movement of objects with contact, percussive sounds, temperature changes, and proceeds toward more complex claims involving intelligence and purpose. At one point he describes holding what appeared to be a hand, feeling firm pressure, and then, as he held it, it gradually resolving into vapor and fading from his grasp. That image functions like a signature. It does not sound like stage magic, it sounds like a man describing what he believes he physically experienced. It also shows the kind of evidence Crooks considered meaningful: sensation, persistence, the feeling of matter changing under his hand. In true crime, a witness's confidence can be persuasive without being conclusive. Crooks's confidence is the engine of this case. It is also the risk. The careful line he draws around dishonesty. Crooks is notably cautious in one place where a reader might expect accusation. When he discusses the possibility that the medium's will and intelligence might influence phenomena, he adds a clarifying note. He does not mean that the medium's intelligence is employed in any conscious or dishonest way, but that it may act unconsciously. This matters because it shows the moral posture he adopts. He is not presenting himself as a debunker. He is positioning himself as an investigator willing to accept sincerity in the subject even when the mechanism is unknown. That posture makes him an ideal ally for a medium under accusation. It also makes him vulnerable to the charge that he is too charitable to deception. Crooks knows this. His paper reads like someone already preparing his defense. What the paper does not give, and why that absence matters. For all its confidence, the 1874 Notes is not a full case narrative of Florence Cook and Katie King. It is, by Crooks's own framing and outline, a statement that he will later publish fuller detail, including tests, precautions, and names of witnesses. This absence matters for a historical true crime account because it forces a distinction. Crooks's paper is primary evidence of his method and his public stance. It is not, by itself, the full evidence file for the Cook sittings. Yet the paper performs an essential function in the Cook story. It sets the reader up to accept that when Crooks writes, "I chose my own conditions," those conditions are meant to carry evidentiary weight. He is telling the public before the public hears the details, "I know what you will accuse me of, and I have already designed my answer." The case moves from allegation to procedure. After Volkmann's seizure and the public language of exposure, Florence Cook needed something stronger than spiritualist testimony. She needed a witness whose authority traveled beyond the movement's paper. Crooks's authority did. Crooks, for his part, needed something more defensible than wonder. He needed procedure, his own house, his own circle, his own terms. This is how the Cook case shifts. It becomes less about what someone felt in the dark, and more about who controlled the conditions under which the feeling occurred. In the meantime, the reader is left with Crooks's first and most persistent claim. Not that he believed, but that he controlled the scene. Chapter 6, In Crooks's Room. When Florence Cook entered William Crooks's house, the story changed its grammar. The parlour opposite London Fields had been a domestic space repurposed. Crooks's home was presented, by Crooks himself, as a controlled environment. Not neutral, not ordinary, but his. That distinction mattered, because from this point onward the Cook phenomena would be filtered through a single voice that claimed procedural authority. Crooks insisted on this detail repeatedly. The sittings took place at his residence, at times he selected, with witnesses of his choosing. He did not allow the medium to set the terms. He did not rely on a spiritualist association's rules. He did not accept inherited etiquette without question. At least, that is how he framed it. The reader should note the tension immediately. Crooks rejected the medium's control of space, yet he did not reject the séance structure itself. There was still a cabinet. There was still dimness. There was still an expectation that something would emerge from behind a curtain. He did not dismantle the room. He claimed it. Preparing the body. In Crooks's account, Florence Cook is prepared for each sitting with an emphasis on restraint and observation. She is described as being secured, tied, seated, or otherwise positioned so that movement from the cabinet to the open room would, in theory, be detectable. Crooks places weight on these details because they are meant to answer the central accusation that Florence herself impersonated the figure known as Katie King. In his telling, Florence's body becomes a reference point. If she remains where she is meant to be, then what appears elsewhere must be something else. This logic depends on a series of assumptions that Crooks does not fully unpack. It assumes that restraint is effective. It assumes that observation is continuous. It assumes that the moment of appearance is not also the moment when observation is weakest. It also assumes that the body in the cabinet and the body in the room are mutually exclusive facts. Crooks believed they were. The figure emerges. Crooks describes Katie King, not as a fleeting impression but as a figure that walked, spoke, and interacted. The figure was said to step out from the cabinet, move around the room, and allow contact with sitters. Crooks records touching the figure, observing its physical presence, and noting its appearance in relation to Florence's known form. He states that Katie appeared taller, fuller, and differently proportioned than Florence. These observations are central to his confidence. They are also the most contested elements of the case. Height, build, and resemblance are notoriously unreliable under low light and high expectation. Crooks does not deny this in general. He insists that his repeated observation overcame such uncertainty. He describes seeing Florence and Katie at the same time, in different positions. This claim carries enormous weight in the narrative. If accepted, it settles the impersonation question. If doubted, it becomes the point at which belief and skepticism part ways completely. Crooks knew this. His language tightens around these moments. He writes as a man aware that his reputation now depends on his sensory judgment. The presence of witnesses. Crooks did not conduct these sittings alone. He refers to witnesses, friends, colleagues, visitors, selected by him and present to observe. This is meant to strengthen the case. Multiple observers imply corroboration. But witnesses do not function equally in all contexts. In a courtroom, witnesses testify under oath, are cross-examined, and are expected to describe events independently. In a séance room, witnesses share an atmosphere, a narrative, and an emotional investment. They may not agree on details, but they agree on purpose. Crooks does not present verbatim witness statements in his early publication. He presents himself as the primary recorder. The others exist as confirmation rather than as independent voices. This matters because it consolidates authority. The reader is asked to trust Crooks not only for what he saw, but for how he summarizes what others saw. In true crime, this would be flagged immediately. A single narrator controlling the evidence file is not neutral, it is powerful. Touch, intimacy, and credibility. One of the most striking features of Crooks's account is his emphasis on physical contact. He describes holding hands, feeling pressure, touching the figure's arm, observing its responsiveness. These moments are meant to counter the idea that the figure was insubstantial or imagined. They also introduce an intimacy that complicates the investigator-subject boundary. Physical mediumship blurred lines that other forms of inquiry did not. Touch was both proof and permission. It authenticated the phenomenon while placing the medium's body, or the body believed to be distinct from the medium's, within reach. For Florence Cook, this meant that her public defense involved descriptions of men touching a female form in semi-darkness and interpreting that contact as evidence. This was not scandalous in the movement's language, it was necessary. Outside the movement, it was unsettling. The case's endurance owes much to this discomfort. Crooks was not only claiming to see a spirit. He was claiming to handle one. The cabinet revisited. Despite Crooks's insistence on control, the cabinet remained the case's most fragile element. A cabinet is not evidence, it is a device. It creates a before and an after. It allows transformation to be claimed without being observed. Crooks accepted the cabinet because he believed he had neutralized its risks through restraint and observation. He does not describe tearing it down, removing it, or demanding full illumination. He describes managing it. This is the central paradox of his investigation. He wanted the phenomenon to appear, and the phenomenon was said to require conditions that also enabled doubt. Crooks did not try to eliminate doubt entirely. He tried to make it unreasonable. Florence Cook as constant. Throughout Crooks's descriptions, Florence Cook herself remains oddly indistinct. He records her position, her restraint, her trance state. He does not dwell on her speech, her emotions, or her reactions beyond what is necessary to support the procedure. She is present as a constant rather than as a person. This absence is not accidental. It is methodological. Crooks needed Florence Cook to function as a stable variable. Her interior life was irrelevant to his argument. What mattered was whether she moved, whether she could be seen, whether she could plausibly be elsewhere. The cost of this approach is that Florence Cook becomes, in the record, a mechanism rather than a subject. Her voice is rarely heard directly. Her experience is inferred only through others' descriptions. In a historical true crime frame, this is significant. The person most affected by the controversy is also the least quoted. The promise of finality. Crooks's confidence gives the impression that the Cook case is approaching resolution. He writes as if careful observation, repeated under controlled conditions, can settle the matter once and for all. He positions himself as someone who has already considered alternative explanations and found them wanting. Yet even as he writes, the controversy is expanding rather than closing. Skeptics are unconvinced. Believers are emboldened. The public is divided. Florence Cook's reputation is now bound not only to her own conduct, but to Crooks's judgment. Finality is promised. Finality does not arrive. What the room cannot contain. The Cook sittings at Crooks's house represent the peak of the attempt to domesticate the phenomenon, to turn something volatile into something orderly. But order does not neutralize conflict. It concentrates it. By bringing Florence Cook into his own space, Crooks tied his authority to her fate. Any future accusation against her would reflect on him. Any doubt cast on his procedures would undermine his standing. At the same time, the very visibility of his involvement ensured that critics would sharpen their knives. The stakes were no longer a single medium's honesty. They were the credibility of scientific judgment itself. The room could not contain that pressure. From this point on, Florence Cook is no longer only a medium under scrutiny. She is a symbol of how badly things can go wrong when authority insists it has controlled the dark. Chapter 7: The Photograph and the Afterlife of a Claim. Once the sittings moved into Crooks's house, the Cook case gained a kind of sturdiness it had not possessed before. It could be described as controlled. It could be described as witnessed by respectable visitors. It could be described, in Crooks's own voice, as procedure rather than sensation. But the case did not become calmer. It became more transportable. A séance does not travel well. It depends on darkness, timing, social pressure, and a room's fragile consensus. A photograph is different. A photograph can be carried into a drawing room, set on a table, passed from hand to hand, stared at in daylight. It looks like the opposite of spiritualism: fixed, visible, repeatable. That is why the photographs associated with Katie King mattered so much. They did not settle the argument. They created a new one. What a photograph does, and what it cannot do. In the Cook controversy, the photograph was treated as a kind of witness that did not blink. Believers valued it because it appeared to show what the séance claimed: a figure in white standing outside the cabinet, distinct from the medium, present in the same world as the investigator. Skeptics valued it because it appeared to show something else: resemblance, costume, staging, the unmistakable grammar of 19th century studio photography. A photograph can confirm that someone posed. It cannot, on its own, confirm what that pose meant. A figure in a white robe can be a spirit, a performer, a servant, a daughter, a trick, a collaboration, a moment of collective belief that crystallized into an image. The photograph does not speak. It becomes a surface onto which people project their verdicts. That is why the Cook photographs became evidence for both sides. They made the dispute easier to hold. Crooks becomes part of the exhibit. In earlier phases of the case, Florence Cook's body was the site of argument. After the photographs circulated, Crooks's body entered the visual record as well. This is an important shift. A scientist who attends séances can be dismissed as eccentric. A scientist who appears beside the spirit becomes implicated in the phenomenon in a way that is harder to shrug off. He is no longer merely reporting, he is present as an element in the scene. That presence changed the social dynamics of the debate. For believers, the image anchored their most valuable claim: a man of scientific standing was not only willing to investigate, he was willing to be seen investigating. For skeptics, the image offered a new target: Crooks's judgment, Crooks's susceptibility, Crooks's motives. In true crime, an investigator's credibility matters because it shapes what the public accepts as proved. Here, Crooks's credibility became part of what was being tried. The question changes shape. Before Crooks's involvement, the most common question was blunt: is Florence Cook faking? After Crooks published and the photographs gained attention, the question split into two. Is Florence Cook faking? If she is, how did Crooks fail to detect it? The second question is more dangerous than the first, because it implies a flaw not only in one young woman but in a public ideal, that science can reliably adjudicate truth. The Cook case began to resemble a modern reputational scandal in which the accused is not only the performer but also the authority figure who endorsed the performance. The scandal becomes larger because it threatens the value of endorsement itself. A culture hungry for marvels, and a culture hungry for debunking. Victorian Britain was not one audience. It was multiple audiences overlapping. There were spiritualists who read the movement's papers and measured credibility by adherence to established etiquette. There were skeptics who treated spiritualism as a social infection and believed strong measures were justified. There were curious outsiders who wanted to be entertained and were content to call it mystery. And there were readers who wanted moral clarity, fraud unmasked, impostors humbled, order restored. The Cook controversy offered something to each group. To believers, a narrative of scientific recognition and spiritual vindication. To skeptics, a narrative of delusion and embarrassment. To the merely curious, a spectacle with a cabinet, a girl, and a scientist. To moralists, a story about danger, vanity, and the need for restraint. The same evidence could be arranged into different lessons. The photograph made that arrangement easier because it looked like proof even when it functioned as symbol. The problem of resemblance. One of the recurring points in the Cook dispute was resemblance, the idea that Katie King looked like Florence Cook. Resemblance is a trap in this case, because it is simultaneously obvious and negotiable. In a skeptical frame, resemblance is the whole story. If the figure resembles the medium, then the figure is the medium, and the cabinet is merely a dressing room. In the spiritualist frame, resemblance is not only expected but doctrinally convenient. Materialization was commonly described as drawing upon the medium's substance. If the medium is the source of the material, then resemblance can be explained without impersonation. Resemblance becomes proof of mechanism rather than proof of fraud. Crookes attempted to address resemblance by emphasizing points of difference: proportions, height, facial expression, the ability to see Florence and Katie separately. But the photographs made the argument harder rather than easier, because they invited comparison at leisure. A séance encourages fleeting perception. A photograph encourages scrutiny. The emergence of insinuation. As the case widened, so did the kinds of accusations deployed. There are two distinct categories of critique that begin to appear around Crookes, and it matters not to blur them into one. Procedural critique claims that his controls were insufficient, that darkness and cabinets invalidate his observations, that he was outmatched by deception, that he relied on conditions favorable to ambiguity. Personal insinuation claims that Crookes was compromised by sentiment, attraction, or personal interest. The first category is part of ordinary evidentiary dispute. The second category is reputational warfare. Later writers would amplify the insinuations because they are more dramatic than procedural criticism. The historian's task is to mark them as what they are: allegations that form part of the controversy's afterlife, not simple facts of the case. What can be stated without drama is that Crookes's public endorsement of the phenomena made him vulnerable to attack on multiple fronts. People who wanted to discredit his conclusions had every reason to discredit the man. The Cook case became not only a dispute over what happened, but a dispute over whether Crookes was the kind of person whose word should be trusted. Florence Cook fades behind the argument. As Crookes's reputation became more central, Florence Cook receded further into the background of her own story. This is one of the crueler mechanisms in the case. The person whose life was most affected becomes less visible, while the men debating her become more visible. The medium becomes the medium through which other people's reputations rise and fall. Florence Cook's own voice is difficult to locate cleanly in the record. The public account is dominated by others speaking about her: investigators, defenders, critics, editors. This is not unusual for Victorian women caught in scandal, but it is particularly acute here because the scandal itself depends on a performance that was, by design, partly hidden. Even the arguments about her tend to treat her as two-dimensional, either an innocent instrument of forces beyond her control or a calculating impostor. Both versions flatten the same fact: she was a young woman surrounded by older people who were invested in her producing something. True crime, when it is honest, resists flattening. It notices incentives, constraints, and costs. The case becomes impossible to close. A photograph, once circulated, does not end an argument. It extends it indefinitely. A séance controversy might have burned out if it remained a matter of private testimony and local gossip. Crookes's publication and the visual record ensured the Cook case would remain usable long after the sittings themselves ended. Believers could return to it as a proof text: look what a scientist witnessed. Skeptics could return to it as a cautionary tale: look what even a scientist can be made to believe. Writers could return to it as narrative material: a cabinet, a girl, a famous man, and a mystery that refuses to resolve. The case becomes not a file that closes, but a story that reproduces itself. Where this leaves the investigation. At this point in the narrative, the reader has 3 solid realities and 1 contested one. Solid realities. Florence Cook, a teenage medium, became publicly known and disputed. A respected scientist investigated and publicly described what he believed he observed. The dispute moved into print and became a broader cultural argument. Contested reality. Whether Katie King was a distinct materialized figure or a constructed performance. This book will not resolve that contested reality by inventing a hidden confession or a tidy scene of exposure that the record cannot support. It will proceed the way casework proceeds when certainty is not available, by looking at pressure points, patterns, and consequences. Because whatever Katie King was, Florence Cook remained real. and the real consequences of this case landed on her. Chapter 8: The Cost to Florence Cook. A controversy can be loud without being precise. Florence Cook's name traveled in print as if it belonged to a public figure with full adult agency, someone who had chosen her role, controlled her working conditions, and accepted the consequences as the price of fame. That is how scandal likes to speak. It turns a person into a character and then punishes the character. Florence Cook was still, in the plain sense, young. And youth in Victorian England was not a soft fact. It was a social condition with rules attached: who could speak for you, who could touch you, who could accuse you, who could defend you, who could decide what you must have meant by what you did. The Cook case, from the mid-1870s onward, is not only an argument about whether a spirit walked out of a cabinet. It is an account of how a girl is treated when her body becomes contested property. The narrowing corridor. By the time Crooks's name was attached to her, Florence Cook's prospects in ordinary work were already fragile. Once your name is public as a medium, you do not return easily to quiet employment. Even sympathetic people may treat you as unstable. Unsympathetic people may treat you as morally suspect. Employers are not obliged to conduct investigations, they can simply avoid risk. For a young woman, that avoidance could become a trap. If respectable work dries up, the room that still welcomes you is often the room that needs you to stay who you are. Spiritualism offered belonging, attention, and, at times, money or support. It also offered exposure to ridicule, accusation, and invasive tests carried out in private spaces. The corridor narrows until the same path is both shelter and danger. Being protected is not the same as being safe. Florence Cook's defenders framed themselves as protectors. They argued that the medium required safe conditions, that rough treatment could harm her, that skeptics who grabbed were not investigators but aggressors. In principle, this is reasonable. A young woman should not be physically assaulted in the name of inquiry. But protection is rarely uncomplicated. Once a medium is treated as a fragile instrument of proof, the people who protect her also acquire power over her. They decide who may attend. They decide what counts as acceptable testing. They decide what must be explained away. They decide when she is allowed to stop. If the movement needed Florence Cook as evidence, then protection could also mean keeping her in the cabinet long after the strain became visible. The historical record does not give a clean interior portrait of Florence's consent at each stage. What it shows more clearly is the structure around her: adults arranging rooms, writing reports, issuing rebuttals, assigning motives, and turning her into the hinge upon which their own credibility moved. A person can be protected from a skeptic's hands and still be unsafe inside the system that claims to guard her. The medium as battleground. After the Volkmann incident and Crooks's involvement, Florence Cook's reputation became a public object. That object was handled by different groups with different aims. Believers used her as an emblem of proof. Their language often implied purity: a young girl, a simple conduit, an untrained channel for forces beyond herself. This framing served a purpose. If she is innocent, the phenomena look less like performance and more like nature. Skeptics used her as an emblem of fraud. Their language often implied calculation, costume, trickery, manipulation of the credulous. This also served a purpose. If she is a fraud, the movement looks like a social disease, and believers look like victims who must be rescued from their own gullibility. Both frames deny complexity. Both frames reduce a young woman to a function. A true crime account must resist that reduction because reduction is how harm becomes normal. Once a person is only proof or only fraud, anything done to her can be justified as necessary: tying, watching, searching, seizing, publicly humiliating. The Cook case demonstrates this mechanism with uncomfortable clarity. The tests were not merely intellectual. They were physical, social, moral. They happened to a body. The public appetite for humiliation. Victorian print culture was capable of ferocious moral theatre. It could elevate a person as a marvel and destroy them as an impostor without ever admitting the pleasure it took in either role. When papers referred to exposures, they were not only reporting. They were offering their readers a satisfaction, the satisfaction of seeing the extraordinary reduced to the ordinary. That satisfaction was not distributed evenly. It was easier to enjoy it when the target was a young woman whose claim to authority already offended social expectations. Florence Cook's age did not soften the appetite. In some ways, it sharpened it. A young woman was expected to be modest, supervised, and controllable. A young woman who drew crowds into dark rooms and made respectable men argue over what they had touched was, in the social imagination, already too much. Even sympathetic coverage could be harmful. Sympathy tends to sanctify. Sanctification makes a person easier to sacrifice when the story turns. What happens when the story outgrows the person? There comes a point in public controversies where the individual becomes secondary to what they represent. Florence Cook reached that point early. After Crookes, she represented the possibility that science might validate spiritualism. She also represented the possibility that science could be deceived. She was, at once, a banner and a warning. At that stage, her personal welfare no longer aligned with the public argument. If she withdrew, believers could accuse her of abandoning proof, skeptics could claim withdrawal as silent confession. If she continued, the scrutiny intensified. Continuation served the movement's need for demonstration and served the public's need for spectacle. The case outgrew her, but it kept using her. Silence as evidence. One of the more damaging habits in controversies like this is treating silence as admission. Florence Cook's own voice is difficult to locate directly. What survives most loudly are the voices around her: investigators, critics, editors, and the respectable men who shaped the public record. In the absence of a steady first-person account, the public fills the gap with assumption. If a medium does not issue detailed rebuttals, she is presumed guilty. If she does issue rebuttals, she is presumed defensive. If she retreats from public view, she is presumed exposed. If she remains, she is presumed shameless. This is not a unique cruelty of the Victorian era. It is a recurring cruelty in any scandal where power and narrative control sit with the observers rather than the observed. In Florence Cook's case, the cruelty was intensified by the setting. Much of what people claimed to know about her was said to have happened in darkness, behind a curtain. That structure already privileges the storyteller. It invites replacement of fact with certainty. The quiet detail that keeps returning. When historical accounts mention Florence Cook's brief employment at a school and the fact she lost that position, the detail often appears as an aside. It should not be treated as an aside. It is a signpost pointing to what was at stake for her beyond any séance, the ability to live a life not defined by controversy. Once that ability was damaged, the argument over Katie King stopped being merely an argument. It became a practical pressure shaping what Florence could afford to do. That is one of the hardest truths in many true crime stories. The accused often operate inside constraints that outsiders do not see. Constraint does not excuse wrongdoing. It does, however, explain why certain pathways become more likely, and why withdrawal is not always available. A reader looking for a neat division between innocent girl and calculating fraud will not find it here without forcing the record. The record does not supply it. What it supplies is a young woman inside a narrowing corridor of options. The emotional physics of a séance circle. A séance circle is not merely a group of watchers. It is an emotional machine. Even without assuming deliberate deception, certain social forces are plain. The sitters arrive expecting something. The medium feels that expectation. The room interprets ambiguous sensations as meaningful. Praise reinforces the pattern. Doubt is treated as hostility. The medium is rewarded for producing wonder and punished for failing to produce it. Under these forces, truth becomes difficult to separate from performance. Not because everyone is lying, but because the room's incentives distort what people notice, how they report it, and what they are willing to admit. Florence Cook's story is a case study in those incentives. Whatever the mechanism behind her séances, the social mechanics around her were real, and they were powerful enough to shape an entire public controversy. After the peak. Public controversies have a peak, and then a fade. The fade is rarely as dramatic as the peak, but it is often more revealing. A medium's public prominence depends on continued production of phenomena and continued public interest. When either falters, the audience moves on to the next marvel or the next scandal. The medium remains, living with whatever reputational debris has been left behind. Florence Cook's later life sits in the shadow of her early fame, whether she wanted that shadow or not. Even when the story shifts focus to other mediums, other Katie King claims, other debates, Florence remains the reference point. Her name becomes a shorthand, a comparison, a label applied to later cases: another Cook, another Katie, another cabinet. That is the afterlife of a claim. It keeps consuming the person who first carried it. What this chapter establishes. This chapter does not ask the reader to decide whether Florence Cook was genuine. It establishes something more solid and less dramatic. Whatever happened in those rooms, the consequences were not abstract. The Cook case harmed Florence Cook regardless of verdict. If she was truthful, she was treated as a site of dispute rather than a human being. If she was deceptive, she was still a young woman whose deception unfolded inside a system that rewarded it and punished her for it. If the reality was mixed, belief braided with performance, then the harm was compounded by the impossibility of speaking clearly about it. That is why the book stays close to documents and avoids invented interiors. The temptation to explain Florence psychologically is strong, but the record does not give permission for that kind of certainty. What it gives is structure: who held power, who controlled narrative, who touched whom, who published what, and who paid the price. Where the file goes next. The next chapter returns to the strongest artifacts the case left behind: Crooks's published claims, the photographs, and the broader press reaction that turned a private investigation into a durable controversy. From there, the inquiry will widen beyond Florence Cook's immediate story to track what happened when the Katie King persona began to appear elsewhere, how a spirit identity became portable, and how portability changes the meaning of evidence. Because once a case produces a role that can be repeated, the question is no longer only whether a single girl was honest. The question becomes how a culture learned to want the cabinet, and what it was willing to do to keep the curtain moving. Chapter 9. The Portable Spirit. A case becomes harder to hold once its central figure can be repeated elsewhere. In the Florence Cook controversy, Katie King began as a name attached to a particular girl, a particular cabinet, a particular local network of believers and critics. The arguments were fierce, but they were at least anchored to a place and to a body. Florence Cook could be pointed to. Crooks could be pointed to. Hackney and Dalston and London Fields could be pointed to. Then something happened that often occurs in contested belief systems: the identity escaped its original room. Katie King did not remain confined to Florence Cook's seances. The name began to appear in other contexts, through other mediums, in other countries. This matters because it changes the nature of the dispute. If a spirit persona can appear in multiple places, believers see expansion as confirmation. Skeptics see repetition as proof of a template, a role passed around because it works. Either way, portability shifts the case from a question of one person's honesty to a question of a culture's appetite. When a name becomes a method. In physical mediumship, spirit controls and materialized figures often functioned like recurring characters. They provided continuity across sittings. They gave the audience a familiar point of contact. They made an uncertain experience feel organized. A named figure also makes practical demands on the medium. If sitters arrive expecting Katie, then Katie becomes the condition of the night's success. The name is no longer only a claim, it is an expectation that drives behavior. This is the quiet engine that turns a phenomenon into a pattern. For Florence Cook, Katie King operated as both proof and pressure. Once the figure was known, the room could interpret partial glimpses as confirmation. A white shape, a face near a curtain, a hand extended, these could be read as Katie because the room already had a slot prepared for her. Portability intensifies this effect. When audiences hear that Katie King has appeared elsewhere, the identity becomes even more real in the social imagination. People stop asking "What did you see?" and begin asking "Was it Katie?" That difference is small on the tongue and enormous in consequence. Exporting the cabinet. In the decades surrounding the Cook controversy, spiritualism moved easily across the Atlantic. The movement's arguments traveled with it, but so did its practical stagecraft: cabinets, curtains, dim light, controlled audiences, and the careful line between permitted touch and forbidden interference. A spirit identity like Katie King could therefore migrate without needing to carry any verifiable biography. It did not need records. It needed only a room, a medium, and a script the audience already understood. This is why Katie King is such a revealing case for historical true crime. The figure's history is not found in birth certificates, it is found in reuse. When an identity is reused, the historian does not ask first whether the spirit is real. The historian asks what the reuse accomplishes for the people involved. It gives the medium a ready-made phenomenon the audience recognizes. It gives sitters a story to tell afterwards, one that sounds precise rather than vague. It gives defenders a brand of proof. It gives critics a brand of fraud. Portability benefits everyone except the person most at risk, the medium whose body becomes the stage. A second theater, a second set of hands. When Katie King appears in American contexts, the story's shape begins to echo the Cook case in ways that are difficult to ignore. The details vary in different tellings, and the precise chain of reports is often entangled with later retellings. What remains consistent in broad outline is the pattern. A medium claims the return of the familiar figure, sitters respond with fascination, photographs are made, accusations follow, exposure language surfaces again. The presence of photographs is especially important. In spiritualist disputes, photographs were both trophy and trap. They created an artifact that could be circulated as proof, but they also invited a kind of daylight comparison that seance conditions discouraged. In the Cook case, the photographs tethered crooks to the phenomenon. In later cases, photographs tethered other mediums to the same kind of scrutiny. Portability does not mean identical events. It means a recognizable structure that can be replayed. And when a structure is replayed, the public begins to treat the replay as either accumulating evidence or accumulating suspicion. What portability does to Florence Cook's story. The migration of Katie King has an odd effect on Florence Cook's place in history. On one hand, it dilutes her. If Katie appears elsewhere, Florence is no longer the only doorway. She becomes one case among many. On the other hand, it fossilizes her. Once Katie King is known as a recurring figure in spiritualism's theater, Florence Cook becomes the origin story people return to, whether to sanctify or to debunk. Her name is used as a benchmark, the English girl in Crooks's house, the cabinet that made the argument famous. This is how a person becomes a reference point rather than a life. Florence Cook's individual circumstances, her age, her local network, the particular pressures of East London circles, are flattened into a single label, the Katie King medium. Portability encourages flattening because it turns complex local histories into repeatable examples. In true crime terms, it is the difference between investigating a case and using a case as a cautionary tale. Portability pushes the story towards the cautionary tale. Competing interpretations that harden with repetition. As Katie King becomes portable, interpretations harden. Believers can say, how could multiple people in multiple places encounter the same figure if she were not real? Skeptics can say, how could the same figure appear in multiple places unless she is a role being performed? Neither side sees portability as neutral. Each side sees it as confirmation. This is one reason the case becomes almost impossible to close. Every new Katie King report functions like fresh fuel. It does not resolve old uncertainty, it gives people new material to argue with. And the arguments rarely remain procedural. They become moral. Believers treat skepticism as cruelty. Skeptics treat belief as stupidity. Both sides claim to be defending truth, and both sides often do damage in the process. The medium, again, is the one who stands in the middle while others fight about what she represents. The cultural function of Katie King. If the historian steps back from the dispute and looks at function, Katie King begins to look less like a single alleged entity and more like a tool the culture used to manage certain tensions. Grief and proof, Katie offered a story that promised survival could be demonstrated, not merely hoped for. Science and wonder, the Cook case especially, allowed believers to claim scientific recognition without surrendering the romance of the unknown. Women and authority, a female figure, whether medium or spirit, could command attention and dictate behaviour in a room, even as male investigators tried to control the terms. Morality and spectacle, the public could consume the story as entertainment while insisting it was about ethics, fraud or faith, innocence or deception. A portable spirit identity is useful because it can carry all these tensions across rooms and across borders. It can be inserted into new circumstances without needing to prove its own history. This is the dark convenience of a persona without records. It cannot be disproved by documents. It can only be argued over by experience. What the case demands next. From here, the book must do two things at once. First, it must continue to treat Florence Cook's story as a real life under pressure, not merely the first chapter in a broader folklore. That means staying attentive to her timeline, her reputation, the specific controversies that attach to her name, and the power structures around her. Second, it must widen the lens to examine what Katie King became once the identity was no longer tied to a single girl. Portability invites a different kind of evidence work, tracking how a name circulates, how narratives repeat, how certain disputes recur with remarkable similarity, and what those repetitions suggest about incentives and method. This is not speculation. It is pattern recognition grounded in the simplest historical fact of all: people reuse what works. Once Katie King becomes portable, the question is no longer only what happened in Crooks's room. The question becomes what Victorian society was building when it built a cabinet that could be shipped, set up, and believed in anywhere. Chapter 10: The Machinery of Circulation. The Victorian séance did not spread because it was convincing in one room. It spread because it was repeatable on paper. A materialization sitting was, by design, difficult to verify for anyone not present. It happened in conditions that resisted outside measurement: low light, curtain thresholds, agreed etiquette. Yet the movement grew, and certain cases became famous far beyond their suburbs and their circles. That growth did not happen by accident. It happened through a machinery that could take a private event and reassemble it as public material. The Cook case is a clean example of how that machinery worked. First, there was a room. Then there was a report. Then there was a rebuttal. Then there was a defense of the rebuttal. Then there was a fresh test designed to answer the last accusation. And each stage left print behind it, like footprints that could be followed by people who had never set foot near the cabinet. Florence Cook did not need to travel for her name to travel. Katie King did not need documents to gain in history. The machinery created something better than biography. It created circulation. The paper as a second séance room. Spiritualist periodicals performed the function of a séance room in daylight. They gathered an audience. They set rules for interpretation. They gave witnesses a script for what counted as proper observation. They punished dissent by framing it as moral failure. A typical report did not simply say, "Something happened." It described conditions: how many sitters, where the cabinet stood, whether hands were held, whether the medium was secured, whether the doors were watched. These details worked like ritual. They reassured sympathetic readers that procedure had been followed, and they gave skeptical readers something to attack. The crucial point is that the details did not need to be perfect to be effective. They only needed to be persuasive enough to keep the story alive long enough for the next sitting. In this way, print did not merely describe séances. It extended them. A reader at breakfast could re-enter the cabinet by reading about it. A critic could respond without attending. A defender could counter the critic in the next issue. The debate could be conducted almost entirely in public language while the actual evidence remained private, fleeting, and structurally ambiguous. This is how a contested phenomenon becomes durable. Naming as a stabilizer. In the middle of this machinery sat the name. Katie King functioned like a label on a file. Once the label existed, new material could be attached to it. A face glimpsed at a curtain became Katie. A hand extended from shadow became Katie. A photograph of a robed figure became Katie. A later medium's performance became Katie. The name stabilized what the senses could not. It turned a series of impressions into a single identity that could be debated as if it were a consistent entity. This served believers because it made the phenomena feel organized and personal. It served critics because it made the phenomena easier to treat as a repeated role. It served editors because a named figure sells better than an unnamed blur. Once a spirit identity becomes a headline, it becomes a commodity. The lecture circuit and the social economy of belief. Periodicals were not the only machinery. Public lectures and private demonstrations mattered too. Spiritualism in this era was not confined to secret rooms. It moved through halls, drawing rooms, associations, and salons. People met one another through it. Patronage flowed through it. Respectability was negotiated within it. A person could make a career not only as a medium, but as a speaker, organizer, host, or investigator. This created an economy in which phenomena had value. A medium who produced remarkable sittings drew patrons and defenders. A circle that hosted a famous medium gained status. An investigator who endorsed a famous case gained attention. An investigator who debunked it gained attention too. The argument itself became a form of currency. Florence Cook's case was valuable because it contained a perfect set of Victorian ingredients: youth, a named spirit, a cabinet, an exposure attempt, and a scientist. That combination made it portable. It could be retold to anyone, anywhere, and it would still feel dramatic. Once a story has that kind of shape, people begin to use it, sometimes sincerely, sometimes opportunistically, sometimes without knowing they are doing either. Photographs as traveling witnesses. When photographs entered the story, the machinery gained a new tool. A written report can be dismissed as exaggeration. A photograph feels harder to dismiss, even when it proves less than the public assumes. The image supplies what print cannot, a visual anchor. In the Cook controversy, photographs did not provide finality. They provided longevity. The photograph could be reproduced, described, compared, mocked, defended. It could be displayed in articles and referenced in arguments. It allowed people to argue as if they were arguing about a simple fact, look at this, rather than about the slippery experience of watching something in dimness. In effect, the photograph turned a séance claim into an object. And once an object exists, it can be owned, traded, exhibited, and used to recruit new believers or embolden new skeptics. It can be carried into rooms that would never tolerate a séance. This is why the Cook photographs are so central to the case's afterlife. They did not prove what crooks wanted them to prove. They proved that the claim had become confident enough to pose. The rulebook as defense and as gatekeeping. As the story circulated, so did the movement's rules. Defenders of physical mediumship frequently returned to the same principles. The phenomena require specific conditions. Bright light can destroy the manifestations. Rough interference can harm the medium or ruin the sitting. Improper sitters invalidate their own testimony. These principles served a protective function, especially for a young medium. A room where grabbing was normalized would not be safe. But the same principles also served gatekeeping. They allowed believers to dismiss the most direct forms of testing as immoral, and to frame skepticism as brutality rather than inquiry. This mattered in print because it gave defenders a moral high ground. A critic could be answered without needing to address the critic's conclusion. It was enough to say, you broke the rules, therefore your conclusion does not count. The machinery of circulation thrives on such moves because they are easy to repeat. They are portable in the same way Katie is portable. They turn complex disputes into simple formulas. Believers are gentle, skeptics are cruel. Those formulas are rarely true in full. They are, however, effective. Rivalries, incentives, and the usefulness of scandal. As the story moved across circles, it also moved through rivalries. Within spiritualist communities there were competing mediums, competing organizers, competing investigators, competing papers, competing reputations. A successful case could elevate a circle, it could also threaten other circles by pulling audiences and patronage away. Scandal, in this environment, had a double nature. It could damage a medium. It could also draw attention. The word exposure is an example of scandal functioning as advertising. To condemn a medium publicly is to place her name in front of new eyes. Those new eyes include potential skeptics, but also potential sitters who arrive wanting to see for themselves. The attempted debunking becomes part of the show. For Florence Cook, this dynamic was dangerous. The more she was attacked, the more important she became. The more important she became, the more pressure existed to keep producing phenomena strong enough to answer the last accusation. The machinery did not care whether she was protected or consumed. It cared that the story continued. Translation across borders. Portability also meant translation. When a spirit identity like Katie King appeared in another country, it had to be made legible to new audiences. That legibility was achieved by repeating key elements. The cabinet, the named figure, the claim of physical presence, the insistence on conditions, the threat of exposure, the promise of proof. This repetition is not by itself proof of fraud or proof of reality. It is proof of a template being used. Templates are how movements scale. The moment a phenomenon can be described in a recognizable set of steps, it can be reproduced. The moment it can be reproduced, it can be marketed. The moment it can be marketed, it attracts people with varied motives: believers, entertainers, exploiters, mourners, and the merely curious. When Katie King appears outside the Cook context, the name does not bring a biography. It brings a script. What happens to truth inside circulation? The machinery of circulation does something subtle to truth. It makes the story feel clearer than the event ever was. A séance is messy. People are nervous. Light is uncertain. Sight lines are partial. Memory is shaped by expectation. But a report can be tidy. It can list conditions and outcomes as if they were a laboratory notebook. A rebuttal can reduce the event to a single suspicion. A defense can reduce the rebuttal to a single moral failure. Each printed step compresses complexity into something easier to carry. Over time, readers stop picturing a room full of uncertain perception. They picture a simple binary, real spirit or obvious fraud. The middle territory, where belief, performance, fear, coercion, and social pressure coexist, becomes harder to hold. This is why the Cook case is so difficult to resolve. The machinery does not preserve nuance. It preserves conflict. Conflict sells. Conflict recruits. Conflict endures. Florence Cook's diminishing agency inside the machine. As the name Katie King gained a life beyond Florence, Florence's own agency could shrink within the narrative. She becomes the origin point, but origin points are often treated as passive. People talk about her as if she simply was the medium through which Katie arrived, rather than as a young woman navigating attention, pressure, and risk. This is not only a problem of sympathy. It is an evidentiary problem. When the archive is dominated by other people's voices, editors, investigators, critics, the subject's choices become hard to trace. The machinery records arguments better than it records interior life. A historical true crime approach does not correct this by inventing feelings. It corrects it by keeping the power map visible: who could publish, who could rebut, who could frame motive, who could define proper conduct, who could decide what counted as proof. Florence Cook, a teenage girl, did not hold most of that power. Where the inquiry tightens again. The machinery of circulation explains why the Cook case survived and multiplied. It does not answer the question the reader continues to carry: what, in practical terms, could have happened in those rooms? At this point in the book, the inquiry must tighten again, away from broad movement dynamics and back towards the most concrete parts of the Cook record: the procedures crooks described, the circumstances of alleged simultaneous observation, the handling of restraints, the arrangement of cabinet and curtain, and the points where skeptics argued that these controls were insufficient. Crooks wrote procedure as defense. Critics read procedure as vulnerability. A true crime file reads it as both, not as proof, but as the place where motive, opportunity, and constraint can be traced without needing to invent what happened behind the curtain. Because when a claim becomes portable, the only honest way to approach it is to ask not what the story says, but what the structure allows. Chapter 11: Procedure as Vulnerability. Crooks believed the strength of his case lay in procedure. He described his controls as if they were a bridge between the seance room and the laboratory: his own house, his own sitters, his own tests, his own observation. In his framing, procedure was the answer to ridicule. If the public could be shown that precautions were taken, then belief could be defended as rational. Critics read the same procedures differently. They treated them not as safeguards, but as the weak seams in a performance. This chapter does not begin by choosing a side. It begins by doing what true crime work does when an event cannot be replayed. It asks what the structure makes possible. If a contested event depends on conditions, then the conditions are the evidence. The cabinet is a device, not a neutral space. The cabinet sits at the center of the Cook case because it produces the illusion of separation. The medium is inside. The spirit is outside. The room's tension is built on that boundary. Crooks's confidence depends on the claim that the boundary held, that Florence Cook remained where she was meant to remain while Katie King appeared elsewhere. But a cabinet is not a sealed box. It is a curtained space designed to create concealment while still allowing partial visibility. A curtain can be watched without being penetrated. A figure can appear at its edge without the interior being seen. This is why skeptics viewed the cabinet not as a neutral condition but as a method. In a legal context, any procedure that relies on concealment becomes the first suspect. Not because concealment proves wrongdoing, but because concealment creates opportunity. Crooks tried to limit opportunity through restraint. Critics argued that restraint could be managed, manipulated, or observed imperfectly, especially in dim conditions. The most important point is simple: the cabinet is where observation is structurally weakest. Any case that hinges on what happens inside, while something happens outside, inherits that weakness. The problem of watchfulness. Crooks's procedure depends on continuous watchfulness. A room can be controlled only if someone is always looking at the right thing at the right time. That is difficult even in daylight. It becomes more difficult in a séance environment where attention is deliberately drawn towards the phenomenon at the curtain. If Katie King steps out and moves, people look at Katie. That is the point of the sitting. If people look at Katie, fewer eyes remain on Florence. This is not a moral accusation, it is an attention problem. It is predictable human behaviour. A skilled stage performance exploits attention. A skilled investigation must compensate for it. Crooks believed he compensated through multiple observers and through his own vigilance. Critics argued that vigilance is not the same as coverage. A room full of witnesses can still share the same blind spot if their attention is directed in the same way. The restraint is only as good as its verification. Crooks described securing Florence Cook so that she could not leave the cabinet unnoticed. Critics responded with a practical question: how do you know? A restraint can be genuine and still allow movement. A knot can appear secure and loosen under pressure. A tie can be arranged so that it can be slipped and replaced. Clothing can conceal what a casual observer cannot track. In ordinary life, people underestimate how easily restraints can be managed by someone motivated to manage them. In performance contexts, the manipulation of ties and knots is a standard skill. Crooks's answer would have been that he was not casual. He was precise. He was present. He was looking. The counterpoint is not that he was careless. The counterpoint is that the record rarely gives the kind of detail that would allow an independent reader to audit each control as if it were a forensic protocol. This is not Crooks's failure alone. It is a limitation of the genre he was writing in. He was publishing a defense, not a full evidentiary deposition with diagrams, measurements, and witness statements subjected to cross-examination. The modern reader must therefore treat secured as a claim, not as a guarantee. Lighting as a variable that does not stay still. Crooks rejected the idea that séances were necessarily conducted in darkness, yet he acknowledged that certain phenomena were said to require dimness. In the Cook case, the boundary between light enough to observe and dim enough for manifestation is not an objective line. It is negotiated in the room. That negotiation creates vulnerability because it allows the conditions to shift just when scrutiny would be most useful. The room can be described afterwards as in the light, while the crucial moments occurred in dimness. The room can be described as sufficiently illuminated, while shadows still exist at the curtain. Even without assuming dishonesty, lighting is unstable in practice. Candlelight flickers. Lamps cast uneven pools. Curtains absorb light. A cabinet corner remains dark even when the rest of the room is bright enough to read. A skeptic does not need to prove that darkness was total. Partial concealment is enough to preserve ambiguity. Crooks's belief depended on his confidence that he saw enough. Critics argued that enough is not a metric. Simultaneous observation, the hinge claim. The Cook case has one claim that functions like a hinge, the assertion that Florence Cook and Katie King were seen at the same time as distinct figures. If this is true under reliable conditions, impersonation becomes difficult to sustain. If this is not reliably established, impersonation remains plausible. The hinge claim therefore becomes the focus of criticism. The questions around it are procedural, not metaphysical. How far apart were the figures? What was the lighting? Who saw both at once? What was the angle of sight? How long did the simultaneous view last? Was the medium's face visible, or only a form in the cabinet? Could the cabinet arrangement allow a projection of a face, a shifting of clothing, a second figure emerging while the cabinet occupant remained indistinct? The archive rarely supplies all these answers in a way that can satisfy a modern forensic mindset. That does not mean the hinge claim is false. It means it is hard to audit. True crime is familiar with hinge claims. They are the points where a case feels as if it should resolve, and yet the record does not provide enough to close it. Touch as proof and as distraction. Crooks and other sitters treated touch as evidence. The figure held hands, allowed contact, responded physically. Critics treated touch differently. They noted that touch directs attention outward. When sitters are holding hands with a figure in the room, their attention is engaged, their bodies are part of the performance, and their capacity to watch the cabinet closely may be reduced. Touch creates intimacy, and intimacy can reduce suspicion. It also creates participation. A sitter who has held Katie's hand feels invested. Their testimony becomes part of their identity in the room. To later admit doubt would be to admit personal gullibility. In this sense, touch does not only prove something, it recruits. Crooks framed touch as a direct physical test. Critics framed it as a technique. Both readings can coexist. Touch can be genuinely persuasive to the person experiencing it and still function as a method within a structured performance. Witnesses and the problem of independence. Crooks referred to witnesses, yet his publications largely route those witnesses through his own narrative voice. This is a vulnerability because it consolidates interpretation. The reader is asked to accept that multiple people witnessed events, but is not always given multiple independent accounts to compare. In legal terms, it is the difference between several witnesses testifying separately and one respected man summarizing what he says they all agreed upon. The difference matters even when the summarizer is honest, because memory is social. In a séance circle, people influence one another's recall. A room that has agreed to interpret phenomena as spiritual will tend to remember phenomena spiritually. A room that has agreed to interpret phenomena as fraud will tend to remember it as fraud. Crooks's circle, chosen by him, is likely to have shared at least one thing: a willingness to take the inquiry seriously. That willingness is not the same as credulity. It is, however, a bias in the broad sense, a starting orientation. True crime does not pretend bias can be eliminated. It insists bias be made visible. What procedure can and cannot accomplish. The strongest thing Crooks's procedures can demonstrate is that he tried to take precautions and believed he observed phenomena under those precautions. The weakest thing they can do is force an external reader to accept his conclusion without reservation, because the procedures are inseparable from the séance structure, and the séance structure is designed around concealment. In other words, Crooks's method can support sincerity. It cannot guarantee correctness. This is not an attack on him. It is a recognition of the case's nature. If an event depends on conditions that cannot be replicated or audited under modern standards, then the historian's job is not to pretend certainty exists. The historian's job is to show what the procedures plausibly permitted. The question that emerges from vulnerability. When a procedure has vulnerabilities, the next true crime question is practical: who benefits from the vulnerabilities? In Florence Cook's case, the benefits are not distributed simply. Florence benefits if the vulnerabilities allow her to maintain a phenomenon that brings attention, protection, and possibly support. The movement benefits because the phenomenon brings prestige and recruitment. Crooks benefits if the phenomenon allows him to position himself as an investigator of the unknown, expanding his intellectual territory. Critics benefit if the vulnerabilities allow them to claim exposure and humiliate the movement. This is why the case does not resolve into a neat moral tale. Too many people have something to gain from their preferred interpretation. A cabinet can hide a trick. It can also hide a collaboration. It can also hide a sincere belief sustained by ambiguous stimuli. The vulnerability does not tell us which interpretation is true. It tells us why the argument could continue indefinitely. Where the file goes next. The next chapter moves from vulnerability to motive and pressure, what the Cook phenomena offer to the people involved, what the risks were, and how reputational stakes can shape what witnesses report, what investigators publish, and what defenders insist must be true. Because in cases that cannot be closed by physical evidence, the remaining evidence often lives in human behavior, patterns of escalation, patterns of defense, patterns of attack, and the ways people respond when their identity is tied to a claim. In the Cook case, identity and claim were welded together early. And once welded, they were difficult to separate without leaving scars. Chapter 12: Motive, Pressure, and the Economics of Reputation. When physical evidence is unstable, motive becomes louder. This is not because motive proves what happened behind a curtain. It does not. But motive explains why the story continued even when the evidence refused to settle. It explains why people doubled down, why they attacked, why they defended, why they insisted the other side was not merely wrong but morally unfit to speak. In the Cook case, the argument endured because too many lives became entangled with a single claim. A spirit persona named Katie King could not be booked, paid, sued, or shamed. Florence Cook could. William Crooks could. Editors could. Sitters could. Critics could. The dispute became a contest over human standing: who would look foolish, who would look noble, who would be remembered as courageous, and who would be remembered as duped. The cabinet may have been the stage. Reputation was the currency. What Florence stood to gain, and to lose. Florence Cook's position in the controversy invites simplistic reading. The temptation is to treat her motives as either innocent or calculating, as if a young woman must be one or the other. The record does not permit that ease. What it does permit is an honest assessment of incentives. Florence, as a young woman in a society where respectable work for girls was narrow and fragile, stood to gain something substantial from being regarded as extraordinary. Attention could translate into patronage. Patronage could translate into support, protection, introductions, a social network that might otherwise be inaccessible. Even where money was not directly exchanged, value circulated, respect within a circle, invitations, the protective loyalty of believers. At the same time, she stood to lose everything that makes an ordinary life possible: quiet employment, an unremarkable reputation, the right to be left alone. Once a young woman is publicly known as a medium, she becomes legible in ways she cannot control. She is talked about by strangers. Her behavior is interpreted through moral assumptions. Her body becomes subject to tests and scrutiny that would be unthinkable in other contexts. Withdrawal becomes ambiguous, read as guilt or as weakness. Continuation becomes dangerous, read as shamelessness or as proof. This is the pressure that sits beneath any simple question like, why did she do it? If the phenomena were genuine, pressure would still exist: the pressure to keep proving, the pressure not to disappoint, the pressure not to fail in a room full of believers who have built hope on your performance. If the phenomena were fraudulent, pressure would exist in a different form: the pressure to maintain a system you can no longer safely leave, because stopping invites suspicion, and suspicion invites exposure. Either way, a teenage girl at the center of a public argument does not have the luxury of calm. What the movement needed from her. A movement that claims proof of the unseen must constantly manage credibility. Spiritualism's promise was not only comfort, it was demonstration. That promise created an ongoing demand for cases that could withstand skepticism. Florence Cook offered exactly that, at least for a time: youth, a named materialized figure, a narrative of development, and later, the endorsement of a respected investigator. The movement benefited in multiple ways. Recruitment: a celebrated case draws new sitters, new subscribers, new donations, new attention. Legitimacy: a case associated with science looks less like superstition and more like inquiry. Internal cohesion: a besieged medium becomes a symbol around which believers rally. But movements do not only protect symbols. They also consume them. Once Florence became a proof text, her welfare could become secondary to the movement's need for her to remain proof. A movement can defend a medium while also pushing her to continue producing. It can condemn skeptical violence while also insisting the medium return to the cabinet because the cause requires it. The movement did not need Florence's complexity. It needed her stability. And stability, in a case like this, is a heavy demand. What Crooks stood to gain, and to risk. Crooks's motives are often treated as either noble curiosity or personal weakness. Both framings are too tidy. Motives rarely appear in single colors. Crooks stood to gain something that many accomplished men quietly desire: entry into a new territory where his existing authority could expand. To investigate the phenomena called spiritual was to position himself at the edge of accepted knowledge, as a pioneer. If he could describe a new force, he would not merely be endorsing a movement, he would be extending science. There was also a social advantage. To host seances, to be sought by spiritualists, to be consulted by the curious, to be debated by critics, this is influence, even when it is contested. Public dispute can elevate a figure as much as it can damage him. A man attacked for investigating mysteries can style himself as brave and misunderstood. Yet Crooks also risked the most valuable asset he possessed: credibility. Once he published strong claims, he created a reputational trap. If later evidence undermined his conclusions, his earlier certainty would be read as gullibility or bias. If the medium was exposed, he would be implicated. If the public mocked, he would have to choose between retreat and defiance. Retreat would look like admission. Defiance would look like obstinacy. This trap matters because it shapes behavior. People inside reputational traps do not always respond with fresh openness. They protect their prior self. They reinterpret new criticism as hostility. They tighten around the procedures that once convinced them. A true crime reader will recognize the pattern. When an authority figure stakes identity on a conclusion, the conclusion becomes harder to revise. This does not prove Crooks was wrong. It explains why the debate could not remain calm. What critics stood to gain. Skeptics are often treated as disinterested truth seekers, as if disbelief is morally cleaner than belief. That is another tidy story. Critics had incentives too. To expose a celebrated medium is to win a public victory. It signals intelligence, courage, and superiority over the credulous. It offers the critic a role, protector of rational society, defender of the vulnerable, champion against superstition. There were also professional incentives. Newspapers sold exposures. Public lectures sold tickets. Debunking made reputations, just as mediumship did. And there were moral incentives. For some critics, spiritualism represented not merely error but disorder, women speaking with authority, domestic rooms becoming theaters, religious certainty being challenged by improvised rituals. To oppose spiritualism could feel like defending social stability. This matters because it explains why critics sometimes used force, and why they often framed force as justified. When you believe you are combating deception, coercion can begin to look like duty. The Cook case reveals the danger in that logic. A person can be harmed while others congratulate themselves for seeking truth. The escalation cycle. Put these incentives together and a predictable cycle emerges, one that does not require conspiracy, only human nature. A claim is made. A sitting is reported. A phenomenon is described. A name is attached, Katie King. Attention arrives. Sitters gather. Reports circulate. Interest increases. Suspicion grows with attention. The bolder the claim, the stronger the impulse to test it. A critic disrupts the room. The disruption is framed as exposure by critics, as violence by defenders. Defenders respond by strengthening procedure. More controls, more insistence on conditions, more emphasis on proper conduct. The strengthened procedure increases the performance's complexity. More structure means more moving parts, more points of dispute, more opportunities for both persuasion and criticism. Authority is recruited. A respected investigator's endorsement is sought to stabilize the narrative. Authority's endorsement intensifies the stakes. Now the dispute is not only about the medium, it is about the authority's competence. The argument becomes moral rather than evidential. Believers accuse cruelty. Critics accuse fraud. Each side claims virtue. The case becomes immortal. Because the dispute now serves social identities, not only the question of what happened. This cycle explains why the Cook case did not close even when it should, in theory, have resolved through better controls. Better controls did not produce closure because closure would harm someone's identity. Closure would require someone to admit they were wrong. And wrongness, in this case, was expensive. The emotional cost of being the proof. The most overlooked pressure in the Cook case is the emotional cost of being expected to deliver certainty. In a movement built on hope, failure is not neutral. If Florence sat in a cabinet and nothing happened, someone's grief would be disappointed. Someone's faith would wobble. Someone's reputation would dim. Someone's newspaper column would go unwritten. Someone's investment, in time, money, pride, would feel threatened. That is the quiet cruelty of proof-based belief systems. They turn a person into a pipeline for meaning. Even if Florence was entirely sincere, she was still operating under the weight of other people's needs. If she was not sincere, she was still operating under that weight, except now the weight would include fear. Fear of being seized, fear of being shamed, fear of being left without a life outside the cabinet. This is why a historical account must hold pressure as a fact, not as psychology. Pressure is visible in what people did, how they tightened rules, how they escalated rhetoric, how they sought stronger endorsements, how they treated dissent as hostility. Why the story could not end cleanly. A clean ending would require one of the following. A decisive, documented exposure that all reasonable observers accept. A decisive, documented proof that withstands independent scrutiny. A confession or a clear withdrawal accompanied by verifiable explanation. A legal adjudication with evidence disclosed in a way the public accepts. None of these outcomes fits the structure of the séance room. The séance room is private. It is curated. It resists independent replication. Its tests are social, not forensic. Its disputes are fought in print and in reputation rather than in court. And the people involved had reasons to avoid clean endings. Believers avoided endings because endings end hope. Critics avoided endings because endings end their campaign. Investigators avoided endings because endings can damage their standing. Mediums avoided endings because endings invite abandonment. So the story continued in the only form it could reliably take, argument. Where the inquiry goes next. At this stage, the file has identified the engine, not only cabinet mechanics, but reputational economics. The next chapter shifts into the later arc of the Cook story, not to invent a private collapse or a hidden confession, but to follow what can be traced. How Florence's public association with Katie King shaped her later trajectory, how the public memory of the case hardened, and how later writers tried to retrofit a neat conclusion onto a record that resisted neatness. In other words, the next chapter follows the aftershock. Because in cases like this, the most revealing evidence is often found not in the moment of spectacle, but in what people did once the spectacle could no longer be sustained at the same pitch. And what they needed to believe about themselves once it was over. Chapter 13. The Aftershock. A scandal does not end when the room empties. It ends when the story stops being useful. In the Cook case, the story remained useful for a long time. It was useful to believers who needed a proof text. It was useful to critics who needed a cautionary tale. It was useful to newspapers that could sell certainty where the room had produced only ambiguity. It was useful to later writers who wanted a Victorian mystery with a famous scientist, a young medium, and a curtain that never quite opened far enough. For Florence Cook, usefulness was not the same as safety. The aftershock is the part of the case where the public interest begins to move on, but the consequences remain. It is the stage where reputational damage becomes practical, where a person tries to live with a name that has been turned into shorthand, and where the archive grows quieter, because the people who argued loudly now have less to gain from recording what happens next. The fading of the peak. Public attention has a rhythm. It intensifies around moments that can be narrated as turning points, an exposure attempt, an endorsement, a photograph, a published note by an authority figure. Then, inevitably, it flattens. Sometimes it flattens because a new scandal arrives. Sometimes because the story becomes repetitive. Sometimes because the central figure becomes less available. And sometimes because the people closest to the case learn, in their private calculations, that continued argument will cost more than it pays. In spiritualist controversies, the peak often ends not with definitive resolution but with fatigue. Fatigue is not truth, but it is a powerful editor. It removes complexity by removing attention. When the Cook case began to lose its peak intensity, that did not mean the questions were answered. It meant the audience's appetite shifted. For Florence Cook, the shift would have been felt as a withdrawal of both scrutiny and support, fewer defenders writing, fewer critics attending, fewer patrons hovering, fewer people insisting she must continue producing. That might sound like relief. It was also abandonment. A name that will not shrink back into private life. There is a particular cruelty in being famous for a dispute that never closes. The name remains contested long after the person has stopped being actively present. Florence Cook's name had been printed, argued over, used as proof and as warning. Once that happens, the name becomes a kind of possession held by strangers. They can carry it into new arguments. They can attach it to other cases. They can retell it with confidence they have not earned. A young woman in that position does not regain anonymity by simply stepping away. Anonymity is not something the public returns willingly. It is something it forgets. And forgetting is slow. This is why the archive becomes lopsided. The most intense documentation tends to cluster around the height of controversy. After that, the person at the center becomes harder to see, even though her life continues. A historian must resist the temptation to fill that silence with invention. Silence is itself part of the evidence of what the record values, and what it discards. The burden of incompatible labels. Florence Cook was assigned incompatible labels early, and those labels did not dissolve with time. To believers she could be a vessel, a gifted medium, a wronged young woman attacked by cruelty and misunderstanding. To skeptics she could be a fraud, a performer shielded by darkness and manners, a symbol of credulity's danger. Both labels were sticky. Both labels could follow her into ordinary spaces. An employer who hears medium may think unstable or disreputable, without needing to decide whether spirits exist. A neighbor who hears exposed may think liar, without needing the details. A prospective friend may think spectacle, and treat her as entertainment rather than as person. In scandal, truth is often less influential than the shape of the accusation. Florence Cook was living with a story shape that had already been fixed by others: cabinet, spirit, seizure, scientist, photograph. A person cannot easily outrun a story shape once it is widely known. How communities protect their own histories. Aftershocks reveal how communities manage embarrassment. When believers are faced with unresolved controversy, one common response is to protect the case by tightening the story around the strongest artifacts: the endorsement, the procedure, the respectable witness. Weak points are treated as misunderstandings. Critics are framed as biased. Doubt is reframed as persecution. When skeptics are faced with unresolved controversy, one common response is to protect their identity by tightening the story around the simplest interpretation: costume, deception, gullibility. Complexities are treated as distractions. The accused is flattened into a type. The authority figure is treated as compromised or foolish. Both sides rewrite the case to keep their self-image intact. The result is that the aftershock is not merely a personal stage for Florence Cook. It is also a cultural stage in which communities decide what they must remember and what they must refuse to remember. This is why later retellings often sound more confident than contemporary records. Time hardens opinion. Later writers inherit a conclusion and then go looking for details that support it. The historian must do the opposite: gather details and let them resist premature closure. The gradual displacement of Florence from the center. As the Katie King identity became portable, Florence Cook could be displaced from the center of the conversation even while her name remained central. This is a subtle shift. People could keep arguing about Cook and crooks, while rarely discussing Florence's lived circumstances. They could treat her as a case rather than as a person. The story could become an object lesson about science, belief, and fraud, while Florence herself became a footnote in the lives of the men who wrote about her. This displacement is common in Victorian scandals involving women. The woman becomes the site of controversy, but the controversy becomes the story of male authority: who defended it, who attacked it, who embarrassed themselves, who proved a principle. Florence Cook's aftershock includes the gradual loss of ownership of her own narrative. The more famous the case, the less space there is for the subject to speak plainly without her words being pulled into someone else's argument. What a medium can do when the room stops asking. When a medium's public demand decreases, there are only a handful of plausible pathways. One is withdrawal into private life, if that life remains available. Another is continued work in smaller circles, where the controversy is less combustible. Another is migration, geographical or social, into contexts where the old story is less known or less relevant. Another is rebranding, shifting away from the most disputed form of mediumship into a less confrontational one. Each pathway involves trade-offs. Withdrawal can be read as admission. Continued work can be read as stubbornness. Migration can be read as escape. Rebranding can be read as evasion. What matters for a true crime file is not to assign motive where the record does not permit it. What matters is to recognize the constraints. Once a person has been publicly framed as either miracle or fraud, there are few actions she can take that will not be interpreted as evidence by someone. This is the trap of public controversy. It converts ordinary decisions into proof. Crooks's shadow does not lift. For Florence, Crooks's involvement was a double-edged shield. It offered protection in the form of status. A respected investigator's support can deter casual dismissal. It can also attract harsher attack, because critics may feel the need to topple not just a medium but the authority who endorsed her. Crooks's shadow could therefore remain over Florence's life even as the public moved on. People did not merely argue about Florence Cook, they argued about the man who believed her, and those arguments could reach her through association. It is not difficult to imagine how that association could make ordinary social interactions complicated. People see the name and want a stance, not a person. When your life is attached to a famous dispute, you become a conversation starter rather than a human being. The question that the aftershock forces. At the height of the case, the main question seems to be, did a spirit materialize? In the aftershock, a different question becomes unavoidable: what did the controversy do to the person at its center? This question is sometimes treated as sentimental, as if it distracts from the thrill of evidence. In a historical true crime account, it is part of the evidence. It shows the cost of a culture that consumes contested phenomena as entertainment and morality play. If Florence was truthful, the cost reveals how readily society will punish a young woman for being extraordinary. If Florence was deceptive, the cost reveals how readily society will punish a young woman for acting within incentives that adults provided. If Florence's reality was braided, belief intertwined with performance, The cost reveals how poorly society handles ambiguity when it demands a villain or a saint. The aftershock is where the harm becomes clearer precisely because the spectacle has faded. Closing in on what can be proven next. The narrative now needs to move in two directions that may seem opposed but are, in fact, necessary. First, it must narrow back to the strongest primary descriptions of Crooks's cook sittings, not to relitigate the metaphysical question, but to map what the record actually says in its most concrete form. The sequencing, the claimed precautions, the claimed moments of simultaneous sight, the claimed photographs, the language used to preempt criticism. Second, it must widen into the later retellings and critiques, not as authorities in themselves, but as part of the case's afterlife, how the story was packaged, how insinuations grew, how the same few images and phrases were used again and again to keep the argument alive. It is not enough to know what Crooks claimed. It is necessary to see how that claim was received, distorted, defended, and repurposed over time. Because the Cook case did not survive as an event. It survived as a narrative object. The next step in the file. The next chapter returns to the center of the object, Crooks's published descriptions of Cook-related phenomena and the way he attempted to make his account robust against the two most predictable attacks. The first attack, that darkness and the cabinet made deception easy. The second attack, that Crooks himself was not a reliable witness. The chapter does not begin by accusing him or excusing him. It treats him the way the file requires, as a narrator with stakes. And it treats Florence Cook the way the file requires as well, not as a mythic medium, not as a stock fraudster, but as the real person whose life was carried along by other people's needs, other people's narratives, and a curtain that, once it became famous, could never fully close again. Chapter 14. Crooks under cross-examination. Crooks wrote as if he could outpace ridicule by being precise. He did not merely claim that extraordinary things happened. He claimed that he anticipated the obvious objections and designed his sittings to answer them. He offered his house, his selection of witnesses, his stated precautions, and his public willingness to attach his name to the record. In a quieter case, that might have been enough to settle the argument into two camps and let it fade. The Cook case was not quiet. It involved a teenage medium, a named materialized figure, a scandal already primed by a forceful seizure, and a culture that enjoyed both wonder and humiliation. Crooks's procedure did not calm this environment. It gave it a new target. From this point, Crooks is not only presenting evidence. He is defending himself as an evidentiary instrument. That shift matters because it changes what the debate is about. The room's events become less important than the credibility of the man recording them. The argument moves from, what happened, to, what kind of man would say this happened? The first attack, the room itself. The simplest critique of Crooks is structural. It does not require malice or scandal. It requires only one observation: the séance room is a poor place to prove anything to a hostile reader. No matter how firmly Crooks insists that he controlled his conditions, those conditions still contain the core element skeptics distrust. A curtained cabinet. Negotiated lighting. A performance that relies on a boundary between inside and outside. An audience trained to interpret ambiguity as meaning. A critic does not need to prove Florence Cook escaped restraints. A critic needs only to show that the crucial moments occurred within a structure that permitted concealment. This is why Crooks's defense leans so heavily on procedure and so lightly on spectacle. He knows the spectacle alone cannot survive daylight scrutiny. He needs the reader to accept that his precautions were more important than the room's inherent vulnerabilities. So the first attack lands exactly where he cannot completely escape, the cabinet. Because a cabinet is not neutral. It is the architecture of doubt. The second attack, the witness. Once the room itself is under suspicion, the argument turns to the man watching it. Crooks is attacked in two different ways, and it helps to keep them distinct because they behave differently in print. One is an attack on competence. It says, in effect, a trained scientist can still be misled, especially outside his usual domain. The critic does not need Crooks to be dishonest. It is enough that he is out of his depth in a setting that rewards misdirection. The other is an attack on character. It says, the investigator's judgment was compromised. He wanted to believe. He wanted to be right. He was personally invested in the medium's success. He was not a reliable observer. The first attack is procedural and can be argued with counters: more precautions, more witnesses, more insistence on light, more insistence on control. The second attack is corrosive because it cannot be tested away. Once someone decides Crooks was compromised, every precaution becomes part of the compromise. The more he insists, the more he seems to defend himself. This is how reputational arguments work. They are not won by evidence, they are won by framing. Crooks's dilemma. Crooks faced a dilemma familiar to any authority figure who enters a contested domain. If he presented himself as open-minded and sympathetic, critics could call him credulous. If he presented himself as skeptical and hard, believers could accuse him of hostility and claim he destroyed the conditions. If he admitted uncertainty, he would undermine the value of his own witness. If he insisted on certainty, he would appear arrogant. Crooks chose certainty. He chose to write as a man who had seen enough to be confident. That choice increased the impact of his testimony. It also increased the violence of the backlash. Because certainty invites a particular kind of response, not careful disagreement, but punishment. Conditions as shield and vulnerability. Crooks attempted to occupy the middle position, rigorous control without brutal disruption. He did not seize the figure in the way Volkmann did. He did not frame himself as a hunter of fraud. He framed himself as an investigator building a stable environment where phenomena could occur and be observed. This stance allowed him to appeal to believers. He respected the idea of conditions. It also allowed him to claim authority over skeptics. He insisted he had chosen those conditions, not the medium. But conditions are a double-edged concept. They are a shield because they allow defenders to explain away failure. If nothing happened, the conditions were wrong. They are a vulnerability because they allow critics to explain away success. If something happened, the conditions enabled deception. Crooks tried to stabilize conditions as controlled variables. His critics treated them as built-in excuses. The Cook case therefore becomes a perpetual argument about the same thing, whether the room was arranged to reveal truth or to protect illusion. The quiet question nobody wants to ask directly. Behind the attacks on Crooks sits a quieter question, one that Victorian commentators rarely handled with tenderness. What does it mean that a teenage girl is being placed under such scrutiny? When critics attacked Crooks, they were often attacking the legitimacy of spiritualism, not thinking about Florence Cook as a young woman with a life beyond the cabinet. When defenders protected Crooks, they were often protecting the movement's claim to scientific respectability, not thinking about what it meant to keep Florence at the center. Crooks's involvement increased Florence's status and her danger simultaneously. He made her harder to dismiss and easier to target. A historian cannot treat that as incidental. It is part of the case's human mechanics. How the file reads Crooks. A historical true crime account does not need Crooks to be villain or hero. It needs him to be legible. Crooks is legible as a man who believed in procedure as a route to certainty. A man who was willing to publish extraordinary claims under his own name. A narrator with high stakes. A witness whose sensory confidence became part of the evidence. In true crime, a witness with stakes is not dismissed, they are contextualized. Their testimony is weighed alongside the structure of the scene and the incentives shaping what they might notice, excuse, or emphasize. This is why the book continues to return to Crooks's own words, not to idolize them, and not to mock them, but to treat them as a primary artifact of a man attempting to make a contested experience defensible. Where doubt becomes permanent. The Cook case produces permanent doubt for a reason that has nothing to do with modern cynicism. It is permanent because each side can always claim the other side invalidated the test. If skeptics demand bright light and physical seizure, believers say they destroyed the conditions and assaulted the medium. If believers insist on dim light and controlled conduct, skeptics say they protected deception and banned decisive verification. If Crooks offers controlled conduct under his roof, skeptics say the structure still favors misdirection. Believers say the structure finally allowed manifestation. There is no shared standard of proof. Without a shared standard, the argument cannot close. This is the file's central finding to this point. The Cook controversy was not only about what happened. It was about what Victorian society was willing to accept as proof, and who was authorized to declare proof sufficient. Crooks tried to set that standard. Others refused to accept his authority to do so. The next move in the narrative. The next chapter narrows in on the most concrete hinge moments that Crooks's defenders return to again and again, the claims of simultaneous sight, the claims of distinct physical proportions, the moments where he believed the medium could not have been elsewhere. Not to force a conclusion the record will not hold, but to do what this file has done from the start. Separate claim from structure. Map what must be true for the claim to stand. Show where the room makes certainty difficult. And keep the human cost visible while the public argues. Because the Cook case does not end with crooks being persuaded. It continues with crooks being contested. And in that contest, Florence Cook remains the silent center, the one whose life is treated as evidence while other people fight over what evidence should be allowed to mean. Chapter 15, Hinge Moments. A case that cannot be replayed survives on hinge moments, those brief points in testimony where the narrator insists the impossible was made plain. In the Cook controversy, Crooks's strongest hinge moments are not the grand claims of spirit survival. They are the specific procedural claims, that he saw Florence Cook secured in the cabinet while Katie King stood in the room, that he could distinguish between them by form and proportion, that the separation was observed under conditions he considered adequate, that the ordinary explanation, impersonation, became untenable. These moments matter because they are the places where Crooks asks the reader to cross a threshold with him. Up to a point, a reader can accept that a respected man attended seances and saw something he could not explain. The reader can even accept that a group of people believed they encountered a figure in white. Those are social facts, and they fit many historical scandals. The threshold comes when Crooks says, in effect, I had enough control to rule out trickery. That claim is the hinge. If it holds, the case changes category. If it does not hold, the case returns to the familiar world of performance and persuasion. This chapter treats hinge moments as a file would, by asking what must be true in the room for the hinge to hold. Hinge 1, seeing two bodies at once. The most decisive claim in the Cook case is simultaneous observation. To establish that Florence Cook did not impersonate the spirit, Crooks needed more than restraint. He needed separation. He needed the room to contain two distinct presences, the medium in the cabinet and the figure outside it. In his record, he asserts that this occurred. In a modern investigation, such a claim would prompt immediate questions. Was Florence visible as Florence, or only as a form? Was her face visible, or merely her dress or outline? Was Katie fully visible, or partly obscured? How stable was the lighting in the relevant seconds? How long did the simultaneous view last? Where were the witnesses positioned? Did multiple people independently report the same moment, or is the moment consolidated through Crooks's voice? The archive does not always provide these details at a forensic level. That absence does not prove the claim false. It defines the claim's vulnerability. A hinge moment that cannot be audited becomes a matter of trust. Crooks asks for trust. Critics refuse. Believers insist trust is warranted. The case remains stuck at that hinge. Hinge 2, difference in height and proportion. Crooks and sympathetic observers often emphasized physical differences between Florence and the figure called Katie. Taller stature, different build, different presence. This is a common method of defense in impersonation controversies. If the alleged impersonator and the alleged persona are physically distinct, then impersonation becomes harder to imagine. But physical distinction is not a clean instrument in a dim, emotionally charged environment. Height is difficult to judge in uneven light. Clothing can add bulk or disguise it. A white robe can conceal posture. A person can appear taller in a doorway, or shorter when hunched. A figure at a curtain can be read as taller, because the room expects a spirit to be other than the medium. None of this proves deception. It simply means that height and proportion, when reported under séance conditions, cannot carry the same evidentiary weight they would carry in daylight. A true crime file treats these observations as suggestive rather than decisive. The important point is that Crooks used physical difference as support for his broader procedural claim. Critics treated physical difference as one more sensation produced under conditions that were not fully reliable. Hinge 3, the controlled space. Crooks's most repeated defense is his control of the space, his house, his chosen witnesses, his selected times, his precautions. A hinge moment cannot be divorced from its environment. If the environment is vulnerable, then the moment inherits that vulnerability. Crooks believed he had reduced vulnerability enough to make his observations persuasive. Critics believed the structure of a cabinet sitting could never be reduced enough. This is not a disagreement about a single fact. It is a disagreement about what kinds of environments can ever produce acceptable proof. Crooks's environment was not neutral. It was designed to make phenomena possible and observation plausible at the same time. That design is why the case remains contested. It sits precisely at the boundary where two standards of proof collide. Hinge 4. Touch as verification. Crooks treated touch as a kind of cross-check. If the figure is physically present, it can be held, and holding it confirms reality. In ordinary life, touch feels like the strongest sense. People trust their hands. Yet touch is also one of the easiest senses to recruit in staged experiences. Touch can persuade someone far more effectively than sight because it bypasses the feeling that one might be tricked by the light. If you have felt a hand squeeze yours, you are less likely to accept that nothing was there. But touch is not, by itself, identity verification. A hand can be held without proving whose body it belongs to. In a cabinet structure, touch is often offered outside the cabinet while the medium remains presumed inside. The room wants the sitter to feel separation without being able to fully confirm it. This is why skeptics often argued that touch in such settings proves only that something touched you, not what it was. Crooks wanted touch to function as scientific corroboration. Critics treated it as part of the séance persuasive machinery. Hinge 5. The stability of the medium. Crooks's case depends on Florence Cook being stable, physically, behaviorally, procedurally. A medium who is calm, consistent, and cooperative makes an investigation feel more controlled. A medium who is restless, distressed, or unpredictable makes everything feel more uncertain. Crooks's descriptions tend to present Florence as a constant. She is in trance, she is secured, she remains in place. The stability supports his authority. It allows him to speak as if variables were controlled. But stability can mean different things. It can mean Florence was genuinely in trance and compliant. It can mean Florence was trained to remain quiet and still as part of the method. It can mean the room's narrative required her to be stable, so instability was minimized in reporting. The file cannot assume which of these is true without stronger evidence. It can only observe that Florence's stability is not merely biographical, it is structural. The entire case leans on her being in the cabinet when she is said to be in the cabinet. This is why critics targeted the restraints and the watchfulness. If Florence's stability is compromised even briefly, the hinge moment can break. The hinge moments and the human consequence. A reader might be tempted to treat hinge moments as intellectual puzzles. Can two figures be seen at once? Can a cabinet be controlled? Can touch be considered proof? But hinge moments are not abstract. They are lived. If Florence Cook was genuine, then hinge moments represent a teenager being subjected to intense observation and then defended as a marvel rather than as a person. If Florence Cook was deceptive, hinge moments represent the most dangerous seconds of a performance, the moments when exposure is closest, when someone might grab, when the room might erupt, when the narrative could collapse. If Florence Cook's reality was mixed, belief braided with performance, hinge moments represent the pressure points where a young woman's fear and a room's demand for proof could collide. In all versions, hinge moments are stressful. They are the points where the body in the cabinet bears the full weight of the public argument. What this chapter establishes. The Cook case cannot be resolved by declaring hinge moments obviously true or obviously false. The record does not allow that. What can be established is, Crooks's strongest claims rest on a small set of hinge moments. Those hinge moments depend on conditions that are difficult to audit independently. Because they cannot be audited, they become matters of trust and allegiance. Trust and allegiance are shaped by motive, identity, and reputational stakes as much as by observation. In other words, the case endures because the evidence is not simply ambiguous. It is ambiguous at exactly the points where certainty would matter most. Where the file turns next. The next chapter shifts away from the room and into the written war that followed, how defenders and critics selected different hinge moments to amplify, how they framed those moments as moral proof, and how later retellings hardened into stories that sound like verdicts even when they rest on contested seconds in dim light. Because the Cook controversy did not survive on what everyone agreed upon. It survived on what could be argued forever. Chapter 16, The Written War. A séance leaves impressions. A controversy leaves sentences. In the Cook case, the most lasting battlefield was not the cabinet, but the page. Once Crooks attached his name to his observations, the dispute became a written war fought in editorials, letters, pamphlets, and repeated summaries that grew more confident with every retelling. The war was not only about truth. It was about authority, who had the right to declare a standard of proof, and who had the right to call someone a liar. Florence Cook, whose body had carried the argument, became increasingly secondary to the argument's language. That is one of the case's cruelties. The medium fades, the rhetoric remains. How controversies become textual. The first step in turning a private event into a public dispute is always the same: someone narrates it. In spiritualist writing, narration had a particular style. It insisted on calmness, precision, and moral seriousness. It listed conditions. It described behaviour. It leaned on the tone of observation rather than the tone of wonder, even when describing wonders. Critics responded with their own style: bluntness, sarcasm, certainty, and the repeated suggestion that anyone who believed must be either gullible or complicit. The two styles are not merely literary. They are strategic. Each style implies a worldview. The spiritualist tone implies, we are careful, respectful, and rational. You are biased and cruel. The skeptical tone implies, we are clear-eyed and honest. You are deluded or deceitful. Once these tones harden, the dispute stops being about a specific event and becomes about what kind of person one must be to accept or reject it. That is where true crime's interest deepens. Because at that point the case is no longer driven by evidence alone. It is driven by identity. Selecting hinge moments as ammunition. Hinge moments, by their nature, invite selective emphasis. Defenders returned again and again to moments where crooks claimed the medium was secured and yet the figure appeared elsewhere. They treated these as decisive. The more often they repeated them, the more the moments began to feel like established facts rather than contested claims. Critics returned again and again to the structure: cabinet, dimness, negotiated rules, the impossibility of full independent audit. They treated these as decisive. The more often they repeated them, the more the entire phenomenon began to feel like theater rather than inquiry. Both sides were doing something very human, turning uncertainty into a story that could be carried. And in carrying it, each side simplified. The written war thrives on simplification because simplification makes a narrative portable. It makes it repeatable. It makes it easy to recruit others to your side. The moral frame: cruelty versus deception. The Cook controversy became morally charged early, and the moral framing became one of the war's main engines. Believers framed skeptical interference, especially physical interference, as cruelty. They described critics as people who would assault a young woman in the name of truth, people whose harshness proved their bias. Critics framed spiritualist practice as deception, either deliberate or willful. They described believers as people who sheltered fraud behind etiquette, people whose gentleness was not virtue but complicity. This moral framing mattered because it allowed each side to dismiss the other without engaging deeply with procedure. If a critic is cruel, you do not need to answer their argument, you condemn their character. If a believer is complicit, you do not need to answer their testimony, you condemn their gullibility. Once those frames are accepted, the dispute becomes self-sealing. Every new piece of evidence is interpreted through the moral lens already chosen. The reputation trap tightens. Crooks's presence intensified the written war because it created a reputation trap on both sides. For believers, Crooks was the trophy witness. If his testimony was undermined, a central pillar of legitimacy was threatened. Defenders therefore had incentive to protect not only the phenomena but Crooks himself. For critics, Crooks was the ideal target. If his testimony could be discredited, the movement's most prestigious endorsement could be turned into an embarrassment. Critics therefore had incentive to treat Crooks not merely as mistaken but as compromised. This is why controversies often become uglier after an authority figure enters them. The stakes rise. The tactics sharpen. A simple disagreement about a medium becomes a struggle over whether science itself has been humiliated. The role of insinuation. Once evidence becomes contested, insinuation becomes tempting. If you cannot prove a cabinet trick, you suggest the investigator's judgment was clouded. If you cannot disprove the investigator's sincerity, you suggest the medium exploited his weakness. If you cannot demonstrate fraud conclusively, you hint at impropriety. If you cannot close the case, you poison it. The Cook controversy is a classic environment for insinuation because it is built on a young woman and an older man in private rooms. Victorian society was quick to assume the worst, and later writers were often quicker still. A historical account must treat insinuation with care. It is part of the case's afterlife, but it is not automatically part of the case's facts. Its presence shows the public's appetite and the movement's vulnerability, but it cannot be substituted for evidence. Insinuation is not proof. It is a tactic. Yet tactics leave traces. They shape what later generations know, because later generations often mistake repeated insinuation for established truth. Compression over time. As years pass, controversies compress. Complex sequences of sittings become a single anecdote. Procedural details become a single phrase, "she was tied." Conflicting testimonies become a single conclusion, exposed or proved. The medium becomes a type. The investigator becomes a symbol. This compression is one reason the Cook case remains so difficult to discuss honestly. Many readers encounter it first through compressed retellings that already assume a verdict. The historian's work is to decompress, to recover the messy structure beneath the verdict-like summaries. But decompression has a cost. It reintroduces uncertainty. It asks the reader to tolerate a lack of closure. The written war tried to remove uncertainty by replacing it with certainty of tone. Certainty of tone is not the same as certainty of fact. How Florence disappears in the written war. In early phases, Florence Cook's name is at the center. In later phases, her personhood becomes increasingly absent. The written war is not interested in Florence's daily life. It is interested in what Florence represents. As the controversy continues, her role in texts becomes almost purely symbolic: the medium, the girl, the case. This is a familiar pattern in historical scandals involving women. The woman becomes the site of argument, but the argument becomes the story of men: the men who tested, the men who endorsed, the men who debunked, the men who wrote. Florence's absence from her own archive is not proof of anything about her honesty. It is proof of where narrative power sat. The written war as evidence. A reader may wonder, if the written war is so partisan, why treat it as evidence at all? Because partisanship is itself informative. The way defenders wrote shows what they feared. The way critics wrote shows what they wanted. The repetition of certain points shows where the case was weakest and where it was strongest. The emergence of moral framing shows how quickly evidence disputes become identity disputes. The reliance on insinuation shows the limits of procedural argument. In true crime, the case file includes not only forensic evidence but also behaviour: who lied, who exaggerated, who hedged, who doubled down, who tried to control the narrative. The Cook case has little forensic evidence by modern standards. It has abundant narrative behaviour. The written war is where that behaviour is most visible. The next step, the final arc of Florence Cook. The controversies written after life could continue indefinitely. But Florence Cook's life did not exist indefinitely in the cabinet. It had a trajectory beyond the most famous sittings. The next chapter turns from the written war back to Florence as a life with an endpoint, what can be traced about her later years, how the case followed her into them, and how the public memory of Katie King persisted even as the person most associated with her tried, at least in the plain human sense, to move forward. The file does not require a verdict to tell the truth of that shift. It requires only discipline, to follow what can be known, to mark what cannot, and to keep sight of the person who carried the story while others fought over what the story meant. Chapter 17. What Remains After the Curtain. The public remembers Florence Cook as a cabinet and a name. It remembers a teenage girl in East London, a white-robed figure stepping into a parlour, a scientist insisting he had taken precautions, and a culture that could not decide whether it was witnessing a miracle or a performance. It remembers the argument because the argument is portable. It can be lifted out of its street and its year and carried into any later debate about belief and proof. But a life is not portable in the same way. A life has weather. It has rooms that are never reported. It has mornings after the last sitting, when the house is quiet and a young woman must still put on her dress and go back into a world that now knows her name. By 1874, Florence Cook's public identity had become too large for her body to comfortably carry. The question was no longer only what happened in the cabinet. The question was what she could do next, as a person who had been turned into a case. Marriage as a turning of the page. In late April 1874, Florence married Edward L.G. Corner. The marriage is often treated as a neat transition in retellings, as if matrimony naturally closed the chapter of public mediumship the way a door closes on a noisy room. It did not work like that. Marriage changed the shape of her life, but it did not dissolve the story attached to her. If anything, marriage tightened the social knot. Florence was no longer only Miss Cook, the teenage medium. She became Mrs. Corner, a woman whose private life could be dragged into the public dispute with fresh appetite. The culture that argued about her phenomena was never going to ignore the symbolism of her becoming a wife, the Victorian promise of domestic order applied to a girl whose fame had been built in a darkened parlor. This is where the case becomes quietly bleak. A public controversy does not respect the privacy that marriage is supposed to grant. It simply changes the vocabulary of intrusion. The disappearance that is not quite disappearance. After the peak months, Crooks's intensive experiments with Florence did not continue in the same public way. The case, however, did not end. It dispersed. Florence's name remained active in print and in conversation because it had become useful. Yet her physical presence in the public record became less steady. That absence is one of the story's signatures. She is everywhere as symbol, and increasingly scarce as person. This scarcity is not evidence of guilt or innocence. It is evidence of something simpler and more reliable. A young woman, once made controversial, has fewer safe ways to be visible. If she returns to the cabinet, she invites renewed scrutiny and renewed violence. If she refuses the cabinet, she invites accusation and abandonment. If she tries to live quietly, she is accused of hiding. If she speaks, she is accused of defensiveness. So the record grows quieter around her, while the argument continues without her consent. Domestic life and the private cost. Later biographical summaries indicate that Florence and Edward Corner had children, and that the marriage was troubled. She filed for divorce within about a year, alleging domestic violence, and it appears the divorce was not finalized. These are the kind of facts that arrive in history without texture. They are recorded as outcomes, not as days. But even without inventing scenes, the implications are heavy. Florence Cook's early life had already been shaped by other people's demands, sitters wanting proof, defenders wanting a symbol, critics wanting an exposure, investigators wanting certainty. A difficult marriage adds another structure of constraint, another domain where her autonomy could be limited by forces stronger than her. For the historian, the key point is not sensationalism. It is continuity. The pattern of power over her life did not end when the public stopped watching as closely. The story did not stop costing her simply because the papers moved on. The long tail of a reputation. Time does not treat controversial women gently. A man can survive a public mistake as eccentric. A woman can be pinned to a single label and never escape it. Florence Cook's label was worse than eccentric. It was ambiguous. It could be read as sacred or shameful depending on who was speaking. That meant she did not even receive the stability of a settled verdict. She was left with a permanent question mark, which is the most socially corrosive mark of all. It is one thing to be accused and cleared, or accused and condemned. It is another to be accused and debated forever. In that second condition, strangers feel entitled to speculate, and speculation becomes a kind of ongoing trespass. A late return to testing. Years later, there are reports that Florence attempted to revive her career and undertook sittings under test conditions in Berlin in 1899, invited by a group known as the Sphinx Society. Whether one reads this as courage, necessity, or a desire to reclaim a story that had been taken from her, it speaks to something consistent in this case. The corridor of options never widens as much as the public imagines. When a person's name becomes fused to a single phenomenon, ordinary work is not always available in the way it is available to others. A return to the role can be less a choice than a gravity. And if Florence did return to testing, the return carries its own quiet irony. The one thing the public demanded, controlled conditions, becomes the very thing that keeps pulling her back into danger. The end of the file, not the end of the argument. Florence Cook died in Battersea in April 1904. The death does not close the case in the way a reader might want. It does not deliver confession or vindication. It does not come with a final authoritative judgment that all parties accept. It is simply the end of a life that had been made public too early and debated too loudly. There is an additional detail that survives in spiritualist retellings, that Crooks, upon hearing of her death, wrote with sympathy and reiterated the value he believed her mediumship had given to others' belief in an afterlife. Whether one reads that as loyalty, blindness, kindness, or obstinacy, it demonstrates the final entanglement. Even at the end, Florence Cook's identity in the archive remains tethered to Crooks's insistence. The medium dies. The controversy survives. Because controversies are not made of flesh. They are made of language. What this chapter leaves in the reader's hands. The honest historical position is not to pretend the record proves what it does not prove. The honest position is to recognize what can be said without forcing the evidence. Florence Cook was very young when she became famous and contested. The public dispute around her was shaped by power, reputation, and unequal risk. Her later life was marked by marriage, children, and reported marital violence and attempted divorce. Her name continued to be used long after she ceased to be at the center of active demonstrations. She died in 1904, and the argument carried on without her. The rest is what the reader must sit with, the fact that some stories refuse to resolve because the conditions that produced them were built to sustain belief and doubt at the same time. The Cook case does not end like a courtroom. It ends like a life. Quietly. Incompletely. With the paper still arguing after the person is gone. Bibliography. Primary sources. Crooks, William. Notes of an inquiry into the phenomena called spiritual, during the years 1870 to 73. Quarterly Journal of Science, January 1874. London. Reprint, International Association for the Preservation of Spiritualist and Occult Periodicals, IAPSOP. Crooks, William. Researches in the Phenomena of Spiritualism. London, J. Burns, 1874. Facsimile edition, Library of Congress. Reference and biographical sources. Cook Florence Eliza, 1856 to 1904. Encyclopedia.com. Florence Cook, Medium. Wikipedia. Archival and Digital Repositories. International Association for the Preservation of Spiritualist and Occult Periodicals, IAPSOP. Digital Archive of 19th-century Spiritualist Texts. Survival After Death Info. William Crooks, Notes of an Inquiry into the Phenomena Called Spiritual. Secondary and Contextual Sources. Gallagher, Michael. The Medium Florence Cook. Michael Gallagher writes. First Spiritual Temple. Florence Cook.